Good morning, everyone. I just want to thank you all for joining our webinar today in our 2026 series of the City of Seattle hosted IPM Management and Recertification webinars. So this is the second of 3 webinars that we are offering this year in our IPM and Recertification series. My name is Kate Kurtz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be your facilitator for the event today. A little bit about me, I'm the Organics and Sustainable Landscape Education Program Lead for Seattle Public Utilities, but I'm just one of several members of the webinar planning committee. So just know there's a whole team of us, group of us that work together to put these on. So before we kick off, I do want to acknowledge where we are and a little bit about the story of this land. And I invite all of us to join in recognizing that we are on the ancestral lands and waters of the Coast Salish people, specifically here in Seattle. That's the Muckleshoot, Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, who are, of course, all still here and have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. And I would like to recognize and thank them before beginning this event today. Thank you. So Thomas Whitney is our first speaker, and he is going to give a presentation regarding entomology basics and insect ID tips. Dr. Thomas Whitney, excuse me, is a technical advisor with the Davy Tree Expert Company. He provides support for the Pacific Northwest in the US and Western Canada. He has a bachelor's in biology, a master's in entomology, and a PhD in forest and natural resources. And he specializes in insect pests of trees. I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Kate, and I appreciate you guys having me on for this. Good morning, everybody. I too have a brand new cold, so please bear with me too. I think I'll be all right. I work for the Davy Tree Expert Company. As Kate mentioned, my expertise is in tree pests. This will be kind of a woody plant-oriented talk, specifically about diagnostics. I give kind of a companion talk sometimes entitled The Signs and Symptoms of Insect Damage to Trees. So that focuses on, if we have sort of the circumstantial evidence that insects leave behind, how can we make a diagnosis? This talk focuses on if you actually have the insect, kind of the pest caught red-handed, how do you go about starting to identify it? So the learning objectives today are going to first be assign primary functions to each insect body segment. We all know insects have 3 body segments. What do each of those segments do? Second, we'll distinguish between the 2 insect developmental strategies, complete and incomplete metamorphosis. And then lastly, and really the meat and potatoes of this talk are going to be differentiating the 5 most important pest taxonomic orders. And I hope by the end of this, we'll learn quite a bit and gain kind of a greater appreciation for these fabulous creatures. So first, let's kick things off with the question of why study insects in the first place. Why are they important? Well, I'll pose to you the point that there's just a lot of them, and that's probably a good reason to know more about them. In terms of relative number of species, if you look at this stylized pie chart here on the left-hand side, 52% of all of the described species are insects. If we look at the right-hand side and we extrapolate out to an estimated number of species, that number goes down a little bit, but nonetheless, they make up the vast majority of different species that we know. Similarly, if we look at relative biomass, so not just the number of species, but how many of these insects there are relative to other types of life, they make up a big proportion too. This is another kind of a pie chart, but instead it's a square, and also represents the gigatons of carbon in each category of life. You can see that plants, as you would imagine, are the overwhelming majority. Bacteria are pretty high too. Maybe you wouldn't guess that. And in the bottom right corner there's that little sliver that makes up animals. If we blow that sliver up and look at all of the animals, arthropods, that big red one in the center there, that makes up the majority, and insects are kind of the make up the lion's share of arthropods. We'll talk about what an arthropod is here. So a lot of species and just a lot of insects. They are very important in our world. Let's talk a bit about taxonomy. That's going to be important as we identify any life, but specifically insects as well. Taxonomy is how we classify life. If we look at the species Homo sapiens, humans, we can kind of go down the line here. Domain kind of separates us from the bacteria. Kingdom, we are in the kingdom Animalia, that separates us from things like plants and fungi. Phylum, that's where we differ from insects. We belong to the phylum Chordata. Chordata refers to the backbone that goes down the center of our back. Insects do not have a backbone. They are arthropods. They have exoskeletons. So that's where things really break down, and we are separated from that form of life. So let's take a look at the taxonomy of an insect. As I mentioned, they are arthropods, and let's use the state insect of Washington as an example. This is the green darner dragonfly, Anax junius. You'll often find these in the subalpine lake habitats in our mountains. And as you can see, we share the same kingdom as this insect, Animalia, but the phylum is Arthropoda. They are arthropods. If we go down to class Insecta, that is the unit of taxonomy that describes the insects and separates other arthropods like arachnids, crustaceans, things like that. And then if we go down one more level to order, that's really the most important high-level insect taxonomic category, and it's what we're going to be focusing on today. But first, let's get into some physiology and start to talk about what makes an insect an insect. We are within the phylum of Arthropoda. These are the arthropods. What are the similarities and differences between class Insecta and other arthropods? So insects specifically have 3 body segments. That is a unique characteristic: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. Let's talk about the functions of each. On the head, there are many functions, but the 2 I'd like you to remember are they are responsible for sensation and consumption. So we'll start with sensation, sensing things. These are where most of the instruments for kind of sensing the world around them exist. The eyesight of insects can be very sophisticated, or it can be very simple. These are examples of compound eyes. Each individual little unit is an individual eye with a lens, some pigment cells, and a retina, and together they form a compound image. So for a predator like this insect on the bottom, that's a robber fly, they need to be able to see very well to capture prey. Additionally, all insects have a pair of antennae, and antennae can act as feelers for touch, but also as kind of noses for smell. They have, if you look at that insect on the bottom, that's a male beetle, and each one of those little protuberances on the antennae have thousands of pores that can receive pheromone from its female counterpart. And that's the reason why the males have so much surface area on their antennae. Suffice it to say, depending on the species, there's lots of different adaptations and forms that antennae can take. Another key characteristic of insects are that they have external mouth parts. All other arthropods have internal mouth parts facing inside of their mouth cavity. These external mouth parts are super important for dictating how an insect behaves and gathers nourishment and really functions in the ecosystem. And so each one of those types of mouth parts can take on very sophisticated forms and can adapt to different types of food they need to gather. So that's the head, sensation and consumption. The thorax is the middle segment, and it is primarily responsible for locomotion. All insects have 6 segmented legs. Segmented is key there. And they will have usually 2 pairs of wings as a default, but sometimes only 1 and sometimes 0. It just kind of depends. And both the legs and the wings can have their own pretty unique adaptations as well. And they can be diagnostic in identification. Thorax, locomotion. The abdomen has many different functions. Just 2 I'd like to highlight is that this is where most of the digestion occurs internally. And then also this is where the sex organs are located. So it's a lot of times a diagnostic character on an insect can be the ovipositor, which just refers to the egg-laying structure. So for instance, on this wasp here, it's curling its ovipositor underneath itself to inject an egg inside of a wood-boring insect in that bark. So head, sensation, consumption, thorax, locomotion, and the abdomen, digestion and sex. Each segment responsible for some pretty important functions. Some other key characteristics of perhaps all arthropods or specifically insects that I think you should know: the exoskeleton. So we have an internal skeleton, insects have it on the outside. What does this mean functionally? If you can picture a suit of armor with plates of metal that are flexible and kind of move in concert, that's sort of what an exoskeleton behaves like. But as you can imagine, if you're a growing, developing insect, you're going to get too big for that suit of armor. And that's what molting is. Molting is the shedding of that skin, that armor, in order to grow a newer set of armor, and that gives you room to grow again. And so, as a juvenile insect, you usually undergo 4 to 5 different molts, and in between those molts is called an instar. It's just the period in between molts. Few other things. I mentioned that we are chordates. We have a nerve cord or a backbone that goes along the back, the dorsal side of our body. Insects have a nerve cord that goes along the ventral side of their body, or essentially along their sternum. And it's sort of decentralized. They do have a brain, but they also have a few other what are called nerve ganglia, little miniature brains that are responsible for local neural functions. We have a closed circulatory system. All of our blood runs in veins and capillaries and arteries. Insects have an open circulatory system where the blood just kind of is in their big open cavities, sloshing around and moving oxygen to its various body parts. They do still have a heart. It's shaped very differently, and its function is to pump that blood around, but the blood exists in an open cavity instead of in tubes. Unique to insects and not all other arthropods is the tracheal system. This is how they breathe. They don't have lungs. They don't have gills. They breathe out of these little holes in the side of their bodies called spiracles. You can see in the photo up top there really clearly. and the oxygen is sort of funneled to individual muscles from there. And the last thing I want to highlight is the fact that most insects are ectothermic. We are endothermic. We regulate our own body temperature. We regulate the temperature inside of us. Insects and other arthropods rely on the environmental conditions around them. And some insects actually get around this pretty cleverly. The photo here on the right is kind of a bucket list item of mine. I really want to see this in the wild. This is called an ice crawler. They're native to the Pacific Northwest and Japan in the Alpine, and they have essentially antifreeze agents in their blood that allows them to be active below 0 degree temperatures. And so the rumor is that if you hold one of these in your hand, it actually heats them up too much. They start dying. So pretty miraculous adaptation to the cold to get around their ectothermic physiological limitations. So next, I want to move on to our second learning objective, talking about the two types of insect development. You probably heard this term metamorphosis before. All it really boils down to is the change from a juvenile to an adult. How does an insect do this? There are two types of metamorphosis in the class Insecta, and this is a really important sort of breakdown taxonomically. An insect can either undergo incomplete or complete metamorphosis. Let's first talk about incomplete metamorphosis. The progression to know is that incomplete metamorphosis insects undergo or go from egg to nymph to adult. That juvenile stage is called a nymph. What is a nymph? A nymph essentially is kind of a miniature adult. It really resembles the adults. All they have are just reduced wing pads. I'll show you a photo of that momentarily. Only about 12% of all of the described insect species undergo this type of metamorphosis, but they are very numerous. You know these insects. You have cockroaches, grasshoppers, crickets, scale insects, aphids, stink bugs, things like that. You see that there's several molts, several instars before one of these reaches an adult, but they all kind of look similar. If you juxtapose this with insects that undergo complete metamorphosis, the juvenile stages look completely different. These go from egg to larvae to pupae to adult. So the larva and the pupa are the two juvenile stages there. Similarly, you undergo several molts, several larval instars, and it requires just one more intermediate stage, this pupa, in order to change into an adult. The larvae do not resemble the adults, and ecologically, this can be really handy because oftentimes the adults and the larvae feed on different things, so they don't compete with each other. Most of the described insect species are going to do this type of metamorphosis, and you'll recognize a lot of these: beetles, moths, flies, wasps. We're going to talk about several of these. So the things I want you to take home from this slide is that the juvenile stage of insects that undergo incomplete metamorphosis are called nymphs, and the juvenile stages of insects that undergo complete metamorphosis are called larvae and pupae. All right, let's begin our discussion of the insect orders. I already told you there's a lot of insect species described and a lot of insect orders. However, we are really only going to concern ourselves with 5 of them. Why these 5? Well, at least in my industry, arboriculture, but probably yours too, they are the most important pests that we deal with. The Hemiptera, the true bugs, the Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, the Hymenoptera, the ants, bees, wasps, and sawflies, the Coleoptera, the beetles, and the Diptera, true flies. And together, they comprise of 91% of all of those described species. So it's not just that they're the most important pest orders, they are also make up the lion's share of all of the described insects as well. So we're going to cover a lot of ground just covering these 5. So we're going to go through each of these orders in depth, and I'm going to give you some characteristics and also some quick ID tips to look out for. But first, how do we look at an insect? What should we focus on? First, the juveniles. With nymphs, I recommend trying to observe what the mouth parts look like, and then also notice the reduced wing pads. This is a juvenile cricket or grasshopper, and you can tell it's not an adult, it's not fully formed yet because it has tiny little puny wings that aren't quite functional yet. When you're looking at a larva, I recommend also looking at the mouth parts, observing the head capsule as well, looking for the true legs. These are the 6 segmented legs on the thorax or the thoracic segments. These are the segments behind the head, 1, 2, 3. And then also try to observe whether or not and how many prolegs the larva has. And these will be on the abdominal segments. More to come. I will clarify. When you look at an adult insect, I recommend looking at the mouth parts again. That's kind of first and foremost. And then also look at the wings. Do they exist? And what are they doing? How many are they? What is their texture? Okay. So let's dive right in with our first group. These are the Hemiptera, the true bugs. I should clarify, you see this word bug here. Let me hide this slide for a second. You see the word bug. When an entomologist says the word bug, they mean something. They are referring to this insect order specifically. It has a true scientific meaning. So the true bugs, the most important examples, at least in my industry, are these guys: the scales, the aphids, the adelgids, the whiteflies, the mealybugs, the psyllids, the hoppers, and the lace bugs. There's several other pest insects that fit in this category that may not affect woody plants that you may encounter, but here's just some examples. I will point to your bring to your attention that some of these don't really look like insects, and that's because this group is a little bit confusing and sort of already breaks some rules that I just established. So I'll try to be sensitive to that as we continue. First thing to know, they undergo incomplete metamorphosis. This is going to be the only group we talk about that does this strategy. The juvenile stages are called nymphs, or if it's a scale insect, they'll be called scales, but that's just the nymph stage. They'll have underdeveloped wings. Here's a good photo composite of all of the life stages of a stink bug. And you can see this individual in the top right corner with the underdeveloped wing pads. Even though it looks about the same size as the adult on the left, you can tell it's a juvenile because it doesn't have the fully developed wings. This is an insect that I worked on for my doctorate degree. It's a scale insect. It attacks eastern white pine. And I just want to show this to you to illustrate how crazy the life cycles are of scale insects and some of those other hemipterans I referenced. If you start here at letter H, the crawler stage, that's the first instar nymph, and they are highly mobile. They're going to move around and find new feeding sites, and immediately they'll molt and turn into the second instar scale stage. And the scale is really the feeding stage and looks not really like any sort of insect you would expect. It doesn't have any eyes, doesn't have any legs, but it has some mouth parts to feed on that we'll talk about. What's unusual here, though, is the female and the male are going to have pretty unique looks about them. They have what's called sexual dimorphism. Excuse me. The male is going to kind of go into a pseudo complete metamorphosis with a quote unquote pupa, but not really, and emerge as kind of what looks like an adult fly. So I'm showing you this just to illustrate that hemipterans can be tricky. Scale insects require training and reps just to understand what you're looking at because they sort of buck a lot of the rules that we establish. But if you can start here, you're going to be in good shape. The mouth parts on hemipterans, the true bugs, are piercing sucking. They consist of this whole beak, but within the beak has a sheath that protects several stylets. If maybe you're familiar with this insect group, it's possible you've been told that it acts like a straw, that it sucks out plant juices or juice feeding on. But it's a little more sophisticated like that. The series of stylets have different functions. One stylet may inject saliva to suppress the immune system of the plant. Another stylet may also inject saliva to create a positive pressure in order for a third stylet to actually extract the fluid that it wants. Just kind of depends on the specific insect we're talking about. Here's another view of this, of a stink bug injecting its stylets into a plant stem. I really like this photo here. You can see that the photographer has severed the mouth parts at the top there, and the stylets have splayed apart. There's at least 3, and it's sort of weaving its way in between this blade of grass inside of it, the storage cells, until bam, it hits this tissue here labeled with a P. That's the phloem. That's the vascular system of the grass. And it's where the aphid is going to start extracting and refining those sugars to get the nitrogenous compounds in order to make proteins. Here's my scale insect again that I studied. Again, a close-up. It doesn't really look like anything that resembles an insect, but it has those piercing, sucking mouth parts. This little copper wire looking thing actually is a series of stylets within a single sheath. So how about some ID tips? Well, for the scale insects, the adelgids, the whiteflies, the mealybugs, you're gonna have to kind of get trained on them because there's no real hard and fast rules. But for the other hemipterans, I can give you these tips. Hemiptera means hemi means half, and ptera means wing, so half wing. And that's what we can focus on. They're going to have 4 wings, but the front wings, the forewings, are going to be leathery, like on the stink bug on the right here. And the hind wings are going to be membranous, which just means transparent, but not necessarily clear. They'll kind of have this half wing appearance where the very terminal tip of the rump, you'll see the wings through the forewings. Another tip that I can recommend is this triangular structure here right behind the thorax. That's called a scutellum. almost all of these hemipterans are going to have this triangle there, and very few lookalikes in different insect orders will have that. So those are my two tips. Look for kind of the half wing arrangement with leathery forewings and membranous hindwings, and then this triangular scutellum. Okay, that was our first group. Let's move on to the Lepidoptera. These are the moths and the butterflies and their juvenile stage called caterpillars. These are some examples of lepidopterans that are pests in my industry. You do have some wood-boring moths. Of course, a lot of defoliating moths and butterflies. The caterpillars are notorious for chewing foliage of leaves. You guys already know this intuitively. They undergo complete metamorphosis. This is the hungry, hungry caterpillar, right? The larvae are called caterpillars. The mouth parts of the larvae, the caterpillars, are going to be chewing. These chewing mouth parts are pretty ingeniously designed. You can see here in this example in the top right, this V-shaped labrum that sort of funnels the margin of the leaf perfectly toward these serrated and teethed mandibles to macerate those leaf tissues into more manageable pieces. The adults, though, have what we call siphoning mouth parts, and this is a bit more like a straw, or maybe like a reverse garden hose, if you will. It's rolled up kind of like a garden hose, and then is sort of extended and is flexible and has some musculature in order to get nectar from flowers primarily. So this photo on the bottom with the extraordinarily long proboscis, the mouth parts, is designed to get inside a very long tubular flower of an agave plant in Mexico. Okay, so these are where the ID tips are going to become tricky. There are other insects that look kind of like caterpillars. So my recommendation is first, with a caterpillar or something that looks like it, determine if it has a hard head capsule. Check. Does it have 3 pairs of true legs? Yes, check. And then this is the tricky part here. Caterpillars are going to have 2 to 5 pairs of what we call prolegs. What are prolegs? So we have the true legs here on this individual on the bottom here, right behind the head capsule. 1, 2, 3. That's 3 pairs. Prolegs are not really legs. They're not segmented. They're fleshy and are really just designed for helping grasp plant stems or whatever it's trying to hold on to. They have these little hair-like appendages on the fleshy prolegs. They're called crochets. They're just hooks, essentially. So you can see here on the top left, a proleg trying to hook on to a stem of a plant. It's really just helping the insect grasp. So an inchworm, for instance, top right, are going to have only 2 prolegs, and other insects will have 3 or 4, or in the case of these 2 individuals on the bottom, will have 5. So head capsule, 3 true legs, and then the presence of those prolegs in the numbers 2 to 5 are really key. And we'll review this in a second. The adults, lepid means scale, so scale wing. They have scales on top of their wings. Some moths you will find will have some transparency, like these, quote, clear wing moths, but they also have scales on the margins. No other insect is going to have scales like this. So that's your quick ID tip. 4 scale-covered wings. Okay, Hemiptera, Lepidoptera, now Hymenoptera. You probably best know this group by the ants, the bees, and the wasps. My industry, we usually interface with the sawflies. Maybe it's not a pest group that you encounter too often. There's also wood wasps that are wood-boring insects as well. So a couple of different strategies that aren't the usual that you're used to perhaps with this group. So the Hymenoptera are going to undergo complete metamorphosis. The juvenile stages are larvae. Here's an example of some sawflies, and you're going to see they look pretty similar to caterpillars. So we'll talk about how to distinguish them. This is what the egg case looks like. I mean, they look sort of like fat wasps a little bit, and then the eggs are laid in leaves. Another photo of honeybees. This group has several examples of eusocial insects, so insects with a caste system, workers, drones, queens. And like the caterpillars, like the Lepidoptera, they are going to have chewing mouthparts designed in a very similar way. So let's talk about the ID type, specifically with sawflies. This group, you're like the caterpillars before it, you're going to start with the head capsule. Does it have a hard head capsule? Boom, check. Does it have 3 pairs of true legs? True legs meaning segmented and on those thoracic segments. 1, 2, 3. Yes, it has 3. Does it have prolegs on the abdominal segments? Yes, it does, but it has a lot more than 5. Most sawflies are going to have 6 plus. Here's another example. This is an insect common in kind of east of the Cascades, the red-headed pine sawfly, and it will have 8 total pairs of prolegs on this guy. There is one notable exception, the so-called slug sawflies. I bet you can't tell why it's called that. They do have true legs underneath, and they also technically do have very small prolegs, but for our intents and purposes, if you see this and you count 0 prolegs, then it's probably a slug sawfly. So the focusing in on the prolegs is really key here. Here's another example of how they feed and how they feed kind of gregariously, these slug sawflies. Okay, so bear with me. I want to try something here. If you can, open up your chat, not your Q&A, but your chat, and we're going to do kind of a live quiz here. So take a look at this particular insect, and I want you to write in the chat whether it is a caterpillar or a sawfly. Oh, you guys are nailing it. We have almost a unanimous response. It is indeed a caterpillar. Very good. Meow. Okay, what about this one? Switching gears. A little bit less certainty, but overwhelming consensus is now occurring. Yes, so this is a sawfly. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 prolegs. The true legs are right behind the head, and we have the hard head capsule. It is a sawfly. Okay, we've got 2 here now. Let me ask you what the insect on the top is. Yeah, fantastic. I think you guys are getting the hang of it. I appreciate you indulging me here, the top one is indeed a caterpillar. The bottom is a sawfly. And this picture really lays it out nicely, just counting the pro legs. So there's your quick kind of field technique to determine between a caterpillar and a sawfly, because they, quite frankly, they look very, very similar. The adults, I think in terms of like wasps and bees, you guys have got this down. Although there are some bee mimics out there that can fool you. Uh, the Hymenoptera are going to have 4 wings, and they might have the appearance of being 2 wings, but 2 kind of large wings, like this bottom left individual here. And that's just because the hind and forewings are hooked together. That's how they fly. They have these specific hook-like structures. But really, for the adults, I recommend, because they're going to have chewing mouth parts as well, just look for the fact that they have 4 wings, and that'll separate them from the flies. Oops. Okay, let's move on to the Coleoptera. This is my favorite group, the beetles. Really, really cool, and kind of the most speciose group out there in terms of insects. That means they have the most described species. Some arboriculturally relevant beetles. These are where most of the wood borers are going to be, and those are the most consequential to a tree's health, are the wood boring insects. They are also going to undergo complete metamorphosis. The juvenile stage is indeed a larva. Sometimes they're referred to as grubs, beetle grubs. I get this question a lot from arborists in my job. Wow, what is this on the tree? Is it a pest? And they're referring to either a larva of a lady beetle or a pupa of a lady beetle. So I'd recommend you kind of visually memorize what those look like. They are friends. They are aphid eating machines. The mouth parts are also going to be chewing. They're going to be designed subtly different. They're going to be more, in the case of this wood boring beetle, designed more robustly for macerating wood fibers. But there's plenty of leaf feeding beetles as well that will be designed similarly to the sawflies and caterpillars. Beetles can have a wide range of chewing mouthparts, though. So here on the bottom left is a beautiful tiger beetle. It is a predator. It actually has, it has those sickle-shaped mandibles, but they're actually hollow, and they allow the beetle to kind of extract prey juices through its mandibles into its mouth parts more efficiently. The middle photo here is a Japanese beetle grub. Has pretty robust long mandibles for eating roots. And then on the right, we have a very cute example of an acorn weevil. It is a tropical species, but it has this really long snout. And then on the very end of it are its mouth parts. Those tiny little mandibles there designed to kind of break through an acorn and get at the germ of the seed. Okay, beetle ID tips. Let's start with the larvae. First, you're going to acknowledge that yes, it has a hard head capsule. Check. And then you're going to observe whether or not it has true legs. Most, especially that you see kind of out in the open, are going to have those 6 segmented legs. The exceptions are going to be the wood boring beetles. They don't need the true legs, so they have lost them throughout evolutionary time. But universally, and unlike the caterpillars and the sawflies, there will be no prolegs. You may need to kind of turn them over to confirm, but there will not be any of those kind of fleshy abdominal segment appendages, no prolegs. Okay, adults, how do you tell that this is a beetle? You're going to look at an insect and assume it has 4 wings, even though it's going to be difficult to tell. On a beetle, the front wings, the 4 wings, are hardened, and they'll be covering the rear wings, the hind wings, which are membranous. So this is a good example. The 4 wings are non-functional. They're just there to protect the functional, actually flying hind wings. This is a video I'm very proud of. I took last summer of a pine sawyer beetle, kind of doing its rendition of Buzz Lightyear. Check this out. So boom, boom. It's 4 wings kind of get into position, and then it's the hind wings that do all the flying. So if you look at the still shot here, it's kind of hard to tell that there's actually 4 wings present, but you just have to imagine. Beetles have this this sort of smooth, streamlined appearance, and just kind of observe the texture of those 4 wings. Sometimes I see people confuse hemipteran adults with beetle adults because those are kind of leathery. But again, there's no half wing appearance there. These 4 wings are going to cover the abdomen completely in most cases. And there will not be that triangular scutellum structure. So there's not really a big triangle either. Hope that's helpful and makes sense. Okay, last group, y'all. This is not a huge pest group in my industry. Maybe it is in yours. At best, we run into, in the Pacific Northwest and in tree care, we run into like apple maggot for amateur orchardists, but not a really serious tree pest. Some leaf miners. They also undergo complete metamorphosis. The juvenile stage is often called a maggot, but it is just a larva. Okay, the mouth parts are going to be pretty funky. These 2 individuals are just fruit fly maggots, but they look pretty sinister. The mouth parts are going to be hook-like, and they're designed to kind of help them navigate, hook onto things and squirm and move, but also to rip apart flesh of whatever they're feeding on to get into smaller pieces and sort of suck up. The adults are going to have highly variable mouth parts, and this is why the flies are so interesting and so cool, is they kind of inhabit every single ecological niche you can imagine. They're a pretty resourceful group. So just a few examples. You have sponging, lapping mouth parts. This is kind of what you see in your house flies, just designed to sort of lap up puddles of liquid. You have piercing, sucking mouth parts like the hemipterans. This is a robber fly. I referenced it earlier. It's a predator that kind of catches insects in midair and extracts their juices from the inside. If you've ever been bitten by a horsefly or a deer fly, this is what was inside your body. You have on the right of the photo some serrated, it's difficult to tell, but those are kind of serrated knife-like structures that are just designed to saw skin and make a puddle of blood. And then it has what's effectively a sponging, lapping structure to sort of lap up that blood. And then the last one I'll show off is what we call reduced, or essentially just no mouth parts. Kind of looks like a demonic muppet, if you ask me. This is a botfly female, and if you want a good bedtime story to tell your children, look up the life cycle of a bot fly, B-O-T. I won't bury the lead. Okay, some ID tips. These are maggots. You know intuitively what the larvae look like here. They usually do not have a head capsule. That's why I've been kind of pounding that point in the checklist, is because of the maggots. They do not have a noticeable hard head capsule. It's usually kind of inside of its body, if at all. And then it also has no true legs and no prolegs. It's a little wormy thing. It's a maggot. You can see here on the right, this individual has two spiracles, two breathing holes on its abdomen, which is unique as well. Most flies have that characteristic, whereas other larvae have these spiracles kind of along each segment of their body. Okay, what about the adults? Diptera, Diptera, two-winged. Diptera have two functional wings, and then the hind wings over evolutionary time have been reduced to become these two sort of pendulum proprioceptic instruments called halteres. And their function is to serve as kind of counterweights to help the insect understand where it is in space as it flies. And that's why a lot of the flies are pretty talented flyers, is because of these haltere structures. Now, when you are observing a fly without a hand lens and before it just starts taking off and flying away, you would be hard pressed to see the halteres. Here's one like rare example, but I believe this is a photo under magnification as well. Really just focus on the fact it has two wings, and that will help you distinguish between maybe some of the bee mimicking eyes and the bees, for instance. One little tangent, I really like the fact that this apple maggot has it sort of mimics the silhouette of a spider. Folks, we're near the end here. I just want to quickly run through some other insect groups that you may encounter. Some other pests. These are thrips. They're very tiny, about the size of a grain of rice. They're a completely different insect order. They have mouth parts that are kind of overlapping scrapers, and they create this sort of stippling and window painting damage on leaves. Mites are not insects at all. They're in a different class entirely. They are arachnids, and they are ubiquitous pests too, so I would be remiss not to mention them. What about some non-pests? Here are some decomposers you might encounter. On trees, at least, I rarely see people talk about bark lice. They are totally harmless. They're just feeding on detritus, but they kind of look like maybe termites or something, but they're a lot smaller. Carpenter ants, at least with trees, are not technically pests. They might be a sign that you have decay or a little bit of a hollow, but they are not actually damaging the trees themselves. They're actually kind of doing a service. Of course, we have our predators and our parasitoids. You might find predatory mites. They are usually red and run a lot faster than the plant-feeding mites. You have syrphid flies. Here's your bee mimicking fly, but you have the 1, 2 wings, not 4. The larvae are voracious aphid predators. You have lacewings. They are a completely different insect order, and they lay their eggs on stalks. You might see those in the field. They lay them on stalks to prevent cannibalism. And then, of course, spiders. Not insects, of course, but they are ubiquitous in a tree's canopy. I'll also shine a light on the parasitoids. These are insects that lay eggs within insects, and the larvae that hatch from those eggs develop inside of the living paralyzed insect. So they're providing a pest control service. There are wasps and also flies that are parasitoids. And then lastly, the pollinators. There are several insect groups that do pollination, 4 of the ones we've talked about, and a lot more. If you are interested in learning more about entomology, especially garden insects, I really recommend this book on the left. It's written by a gentleman from Colorado State, but it kind of applies nationally. This other book is pretty hardcore entomology, but it could be good if you really like to get in the weeds with identification. And then I really recommend, if you're interested in learning more about ID, get on iNaturalist or use the Seek app. Bug Guide can be good too. That's where the entomologists sort of put their iNat entries specifically, but iNaturalist is quickly taking over. That's all I've got for you guys. I appreciate your time. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Thomas. That was super informative, and I loved like kind of like relearning a lot of that stuff. I think that's a lot of things that I had like maybe was introduced to long ago, and this was like a deep dive and a refresher, and it was just delightful. So thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a really fun presentation. I always love seeing all the insects coming into the gardens and um, trying to identify, what it is in each stage and whatnot. I had a quick question for my own personal thing. I've been told that if you squish the aphids, that kind of puts out the frass a little bit, and then it attracts the lady beetles to come and eat them. Is that true, or is that just a, I don't know, wives' tale?
No, there's some truth to that. First, you used a bit of jargon, which is important. Frass. That's a great term. If you want to impress your clients, everyone, you use that term to refer to insect poop. Um, yeah, so aphids do have the ability to put out chemical signals to alert their brethren to drop to avoid predators, but the predators have co-opted that signal to be like, hey, there's a population here. So it kind of cuts both ways. I suppose if you squeeze them, yeah, the chemicals would be released.
I like to think that that's what I'm doing when I smush a little bit. I mean, aphids are so prolific. Um, I'm doing a little bit of damage to some of these guys and also calling in their predators. So that's my IPM
Keep
strategy.
doing it. Why not?
All right, I'm going to stop sharing and see about some other questions that we have here. All right, and the one and only question I see here in the Q&A is about aphids, and uh, Nick asks, how about aphids? What order are they, and are they mostly native here or non-native?
Good question. I should have clarified that. Aphids are in the true bugs. They are hemipterans. They have the piercing, sucking mouth parts, so they're just staying put, sort of extracting plant juices. And that's why they produce the honeydew. That sticky substance is they're so busy extracting from the phloem of the tree, which is transpiring, that they essentially need to relieve that built up positive pressure. And so they're just kind of expelling some of that sticky, sugary honeydew. They are native. There's so many species of aphids that you will encounter.
Thank you. Next up, Bridget asks, do viburnum beetle eggs look like small black dots at this time of year? She believes they emerge in May.
Question, I truthfully don't know exactly what the eggs look like. I haven't encountered them, but they do start emerging in May, and feeding on those kind of soft viburnum species. The if you're looking for an insecticide product to check out acelepryn or that active ingredient
Yeah, I was
is
going to ask you about acelepryn later, so I'm glad you bring that up.
it's a good product, and luckily the patent just expired, and we're starting to see some cheaper generics come on the market.
Mhm.
But that's a good one for leaf feeding beetles and viburnum leaf beetles specifically.
Cool. Yeah. WSCA had just sent me a few. They're asking to be able to treat the Japanese beetle in some of our right-of-ways here at Seattle City Light, and they're looking to use acelepryn. So,
That's the
um,
one. Yeah,
yeah,
I would
I'm
definitely
glad you
use
got
that one.
that. Okay. I'm glad to hear that. Um, let's see. Next up, Anastasia asks, are there any insect classes that don't involve destructive sampling?
Um, like classroom classes or field classes? I'm not sure I understand necessarily the question.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you. Maybe Anastasia can elaborate a little bit.
Um, yeah, that's I'm often people when they learn I'm an entomologist, they assume I'm some sort of card carrying like insect lover, which I am. But I've necessarily had to preserve and cause the demise of several insects in my day. So destructive sampling, unfortunately, is necessary in some cases.
Yeah. Jillian asks, what is your favorite beetle?
Oh man, it's hard to pick your favorite child, right? I showed off that tiger beetle, that brilliant green metallic beetle. I really like tiger beetles. They usually are in sandy riparian environments, and they crawl super fast, and they're ferocious predators. So let's go with the tiger beetle.
All right. All right. Stephen asks, I've heard some differing opinions on how long to let your pine slash dry out after thinning when managing for IPS. Thinking industrial forestry, when would you suggest to stop thinning pine stands in order to let your pine slash dry out and to avoid IPS affecting your residual stand? July 1st, August 1st, September 1st?
That's a good question. Just to clarify, he's talking about Ips beetles. That's the genus name.
Thank you.
It's a type of bark beetle. Um, that's a good question, Steve, I would have to brush up on my best management practices for Ips, specifically in forestry stands. But generally speaking, as soon as you thin out a stand, they're going to be just magnets for uh, for Ips, and so it could be good practice to remove them promptly. I'm going to plead ignorance on this one and say, refer to your local extension office though.
Great. All right, next question. What is the mechanism of diatomaceous earth that kills insects?
If I'm not mistaken, it is purely mechanical. There's no chemical toxicity. There's no like residual toxicity. It's all physical, and I believe it just sort of inadvertently breaks into the exoskeleton, and I believe cause desiccation eventually of the insects. It's a little bit too blunt of an instrument for many like commercial applications. For certain types of home purposes, I guess it can be a good measure.
Cool. And I have one last question. Do we have time for that, Kate?
We are actually past now, so just because I want to make sure everybody gets the break that they need between presentations. But Thomas, if you're able to, maybe you can type
Sure.
answer, to some of these, remaining questions, if you have time and it's easy enough for you to do. Hey, I just want to say thank you again. That was an awesome presentation. I'm still boggled by the relative mass of animals being so low, and
Yeah,
bacteria being so high. Not gonna
I
lie.
was too. You're not alone. Thank you so much for the compliments, and I appreciate it, everyone.
I am excited to introduce our next speaker in today's webinar. Um, Kevin O'Connor of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and he will be speaking about conflict and coexistence with coyotes in the urban environment. I'm so excited about this one, actually. He's also going to touch on other mammalian predators such as raccoons, bears, and bobcats. Um, so a little bit about Kevin. He has worked in human-wildlife conflict for more than a decade. He holds a Master's of Science degree from the University of Idaho and has worked with black bears in the Sierra Nevada, wolves in eastern Washington, oh my God, that's so exciting, and a diversity of wildlife species both in urban and remote environments. His current position focuses on reducing human-wildlife conflict through public education, landowner engagement, and the management of carnivore and ungulate species in King and Snohomish counties. Thank you so much, Kevin.
Yes, absolutely, Kate. Well, thanks for having me today, and I appreciate the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Kevin O'Connor with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. As Kate mentioned, I'm the wildlife conflict specialist. So I work very frequently with coyotes and raccoons in our urban environments and around both King and Snohomish counties, along with some of those larger carnivores and other ungulates and charismatic species that we have here. But today we'll focus primarily on coyotes and raccoons in our urban environments. So most people don't know this, but coyotes are not native to the western states. They're actually native to the plains area in the southwest. During European expansion and alterations to the landscape and the predator populations, coyotes expanded their range. So they originally from those kind of Great Plains, moving down into the southern drier states. Once European settlement began and people began to do heavy predator control, so predator control of bear, cougar, and bobcat, these charismatic little coyotes started to expand their range. So here's just a quick picture on how to tell the difference between a coyote and a wolf. And you can see why they were kind of limited in their range historically. So wolves they're big animals. They're 5 to 6 feet long, 2.5 feet tall. Females in that 80 pounds range, with males getting up to about 120. Oops. Coyotes are also fairly large animals. Coyotes are about 4 feet long, a foot and a half tall, and can range between 20 and 50 pounds. Even with access to human food resources or areas with an abundance of food resources, they do tend to stay in that same range. I always picture, my old lab just got really big as we kept feeding him and getting older. But coyotes tend to stay about that same weight. But there's a diversity in how much these animals weigh. So often we hear people say, oh, a coyote looks really thin, or, oh, that coyote is really fat and healthy and happy. It's normal. It's normal to have that changes in weight, whether it be seasonally or in between individual animals. So the first coyote specimen was collected by the Burke Museum in Enumclaw in 1937. I wish I had a little bit more detail on or data on the time frame of expansion, but you can see here that coyotes have expanded the range again from the plains area down through what is now Mexico, all across North America. It's not just predators, the removal of larger carnivores that allowed for the expansion of the range for coyotes, but also alterations to landscapes. So as we modify the environment for our recreational or aesthetic purposes. We open the environment to some of these smaller critters that really also favor these types of habitats. So for example, cemeteries, golf courses, airports, large sports playing fields. Those are all really great habitats for coyotes. They find great food resources there. They get seen long distance. There's less concern of predation in some of those areas from larger animals. So our alteration of those habitats really allowed for providing great habitat for these animals. So we'll talk a little bit about coyote ecology, what they eat, and then we'll kind of get into some of the coyote conflict questions. So coyotes are made up of, coyote packs are made up of a mating pair, an alpha male and an alpha female. There are also individual or solitary coyotes that do occupy the landscape. They are not always in a mating pair. And often this mating pair will hunt and collect food relatively solitarily. They'll break off from each other. They'll go hunting, for a couple hours or even a couple days, and then come back together. So a little on the life history of coyotes. So life history is the process of energy collection and reproduction. So coyotes mate in late February. They begin to dig den sites in March. The females do. And then they have anywhere from 4 to 7 pups born right around that April timeframe. These pups are very small when they're born. You can see they're cute as heck, and they stay relatively close to the den site. One thing to keep in mind with the life history of coyotes is how that time frame affects human-wildlife conflict. So in late February, when they're beginning to mate, then into March when they're selecting their den site, these animals can become a bit more territorial of those den sites. And then again, when those pups are born, the female and male will be very territorial of those puppies until they're mobile and free to move about the landscape and hunt with the parents. So we'll go back or we'll come to a little bit more information about human-wildlife conflict, but keep those time frames and those dates in mind. So this is really cool data. This shows coyote pack territories. So coyotes don't have as defined territorial boundaries as a wolf or a cougar might, and they often overlap with other coyotes within a greater expansion. So you can see the yellow lines here are collared animals, and you can see the territorial boundaries that they occupy. There's a lot of overlap there between those solitary animals. And then the colored lines in there are those mating pairs, so that alpha male and alpha female, and their territories, depending on the season in which this data was collected, could show some of those boundaries during denning and or pupping season. But a lot of overlap with coyotes on the environment. Typically, that's related to food resource availability. So how much food is on the landscape. So if they're able to find small mammals, urban human food resources very frequently and easily, those territories, or sorry, those populations are going to be a little bit more tightly packed together. Over here, the purple dots, this is cool. This is just a single female just moving around the environment. You can see they utilize some of these green spaces, but often border some of these more open areas where food resources are available. So what good are coyotes? So coyotes are good for a lot of things, turns out. So they eat a lot of these small rodent populations, mice, rats, voles, rabbits. Out here in Western Washington, I'm sure we're all aware of the non-native rabbit population. So coyotes are great at predating on those species and helping to manage those populations. So they actually provide what is called an ecosystem service by providing some population management of those non-native or invasive species. They also help manage some of the resident deer populations in some areas across North America or the United States. Urban deer populations without predation, without hunting or protection, those deer populations can grow fairly quickly. And so coyotes help, again, manage some of those populations by predating on fawns. Canadian geese are a hot topic out here, especially at least for me in Snohomish County. We get amazing migratory bird species that fly down on the Pacific Flyway. However, they often conflict with some of the landscapes that we've designed to recreate on. So beaches, parks, those open grassy spaces that are covered in goose poop. Coyotes play a major role in, again, managing those populations and providing an ecosystem service for us. So their diet is extremely variable. The scientific name is Canis latrans. Basically, they could eat anything and do just fine. So if you're moving around our environments, you may notice different scat on the ground. Depending on what the animal eats, you may see some differences in content as well as structure. So this first picture here is obviously, there's some hair in there. It's very dense, probably some protein from eating a rabbit or a similar species. Whereas seasonally, they may consume more fruits or berries, and this you can see more of a patty with some of those berry seeds that are in there. They're also very partial to tree fruit. So here you can see some type of tree fruit nut in there. And again, that structure is quite different than eating those small rabbits or mammals. So there was a study by Tim Quinns. I should have added the date to this. But he found that the contents of coyotes' diet is highly variable. So they again eat fruit, tree fruit like apples, cherries, and other tree fruit. At 43% of their diet, 38% of their diet was small mammals, with 13% of that being domestic cats. Voles, squirrels, mountain beaver, and other small mammals are always on the menu for coyotes. It's also interesting to see that 4.5% of their diet was dog food in this study, as well as grass and other vegetation, bird, reptile, and of course garbage. Garbage is an easy food resource for coyotes. These animals are extremely smart, extremely adaptive. We call it plasticity. So these animals can adapt, their behavior can adapt to the environment that they're in order to be able to find those food resources. So I know everybody's thinking about that 13% of domestic cats in the coyotes' diet. House cats are outdoor house cats, outdoor domestic cats are very common. We try to provide a lot of education on keeping cats inside. One, so they don't get eaten by coyotes or other predatory species out there, but also domestic cats do predate on some of our smaller populations. I don't know a ton about birds, so I'm not really the one to answer too many questions about this. But one California study found that with coyotes occupying a certain fragment of a habitat, they actually saw an increase in the songbird population. And there is some correlation there with coyotes predating on some of those house cats, or at least excluding them from those areas. So feeding coyotes, I think this is an excellent picture. We say never feed wildlife. Coyotes, especially, again, there's a lot of conversation between the public and myself, that this animal is looking thin. I don't know if it's sick. There's plenty of food out there for coyotes, so please don't feed the coyotes. Often people will see, what appears to be a scrawny coyote on the ground, and provide some dog food or other table scraps to it. Unfortunately, this changes the coyote's behavior. It is one of the only species where we do see a bit of an escalation from normal hunting behavior to habituation to humans, and a certain level of comfort around people. So it's really important not to feed coyotes regardless of how they're looking out there. Again, there's plenty of food resources on the ground for these animals. So if you're not seeing coyote, or if you're not feeding coyotes, but you're still seeing coyotes, the chances are they still have access to human food resources in one way or another. Regular coyote presence is often associated with, what we have outside of our homes. Trash being a big one of them. Bird seed, pet food, fruit trees, all of that is an attractant that actually attracts these animals to our properties, and that's why we tend to see a higher frequency of these animals moving around. So intentionally or unintentionally, someone in the neighborhood is probably feeding coyotes out there. So talk to your neighbors about identifying and removing coyote attractants. I know that's a raccoon. That's actually a cute raccoon picture. But talk to your neighbors about removing or securing garbage cans. Electric fence around tree fruit seasonally is a really good non-lethal exclusion tool that we highly recommend. We recommend never feeding birds. We'll get into that in another slide, but that can also attract some of these larger animals to your property. And we definitely recommend never feeding pets outdoors. That scent of pet food, that's a high calorie, really tasty meal for a coyote. So here's just some examples of situations where, there's a couple food resources on the ground in this photo, unfortunately. So we have the cats, small mammals is the way coyotes see them, small mammal food resource, as well as that cat food that's out there. Again, tree fruit is that rotten fruit on the ground is a huge attractant for coyotes and other omnivores or larger species. So we definitely recommend cleaning up that rotten tree fruit off the ground, trying to harvest the fruit from the trees as soon as it's ripe. And then again, if you need to include some type of exclusion, there's temporary electric fencing that is very effective for a ton of species. It's not harmful. I've been zapped probably 100 times. My dog has gotten zapped. It's scary. It hurts a little bit, but it's not going to hurt the animals. Also think about, why other species on the landscape. So there may be native or non-native species that occupy your property that may be attracting coyotes. This is I'm not sure what those are in the background. But I really want to change this photo to include chickens. At least out here in Western Washington, we all have excellent properties for having chickens, and coyotes, turns out most things like to eat chickens. So I might have to change that in the future there. So going back to not feeding birds, we'll talk about a little bit about trophic ecology and trophic level associations. So basically the food web. So when there is food on the ground for a target species like bird, so you're putting bird seed out to attract birds to your properties, you're also attracting other species. So it looks like here that there may be a rat on the ground there that's eating that bird seed. And then if you think, if there's both bird seed and small mammals out there, you're going to be attracting those animals that predate on those species. So you're that trophic level association. You may be trying to feed one species, but you're going to get the other species attracted to your property as well. So are coyotes a threat to humans, or are they dangerous? In the Washington state history, there have been very, very few human contact incidents. So an attack, any contact with a person, a bite or injury is an attack. This needs a little bit of update, but in the state history, it's probably around 4 people that have been bitten by coyotes. The primary reason that people come into contact and are bitten by coyotes is because those coyotes are being fed. So when these coyotes are fed, they lose their fear of people, and they often come around to those same locations or different properties looking for handouts. Most of the bites that I've seen in my career, the coyotes come up and they check you out, and you may stick your hand out to say hi, and they bite your hand because there's actually no food in your hand for them. So it's not that they are predatory towards people or kids. They are not. We are not on the menu, but it really is just habituation to human food resources, as well as losing that natural fear of people. Again, they're extremely smart and adaptive, and so they can quickly become comfortable with humans in a short time frame. Domestic dogs and coyotes are like arch nemesis in old cartoons. The primary reasons that we see contact or attacks with dogs is it's typically small dogs that are either off leash or moving around coyote habitat. Again, to a coyote, small dogs and cats, they just look like small mammals. They don't know that it's our pet. They don't know that we love and appreciate these animals. To them, it's just another food resource. For these, again, highly adaptable animals. Dog bites can vary. With smaller dogs, it can be lethal. For larger dogs, less so, but it can cause injury. Going back to the seasonality, so we do see increased coyote to dog contact or attacks during that pupping season, denning and pupping season, as those coyotes become more defensive of those locations. They'll become much more defensive of dogs, whether that be on leash or especially off leash around their den sites. So coyotes are new to Seattle, right? Actually, not so much. So again, we had that first specimen collected by the Burke Museum in 1937. And coyotes, at least from Fish and Wildlife's role in managing and working with the public on education for coyotes, we've been receiving consistent calls about coyotes since the 1990s. Other areas where coyotes are very common and that we often receive calls from are Shoreline, Edmonds, Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond. Basically, if you're in King County, Snohomish County, or Washington State, I'm sure there's some coyotes moving around the environment. Particularly for our area, we have amazing green belts. We have, beautiful forested properties, which provide, great movement corridors for these animals, as well as provide sustainable food resources for these coyotes or these animals. And again, those altered landscapes, so golf courses, sports fields, cemeteries, those are all great adjacent edge habitats for these animals to find food and move around. So how can you keep your pets safe? So go back to house cats, or domestic cats, I should say. We always recommend keeping cats inside. They live longer, they're healthier, they're happier. outdoor cats, tend to have encounters with raccoons, cars, dogs, feline leukemia, and other parasites and diseases. One option is to build what is commonly referred to now as a catio. So you basically build an outdoor patio structure for your cat with a full enclosure. So just think of a really fancy chicken coop. Wood frame, good heavy wire on there, and it never hurts to add electric fencing. Again, it's non-lethal and it's very effective. That provides excellent ways for your cat to just slide out a window when they need, or a door, to have that outdoor time, to check out nature and all the wildlife that's out there. Here's just another cute picture of a cat. So how about dogs? So like we talked about, small dogs are more highly prone to having negative interactions with coyotes. Small dogs should always, all dogs, but especially small dogs, should always be on a leash and under control of the owner. It's recommended that you keep an eye on your small dogs, even in the backyard. Make sure they're being attended to. We have lots of encounters with wildlife and small dogs that are unattended in people's backyards. So keep an eye on them. Go out there with them. Old dogs as well. They're moving slow. They're not getting around as well, and it's an easy target for a coyote. Again, coyotes just think of these as other small food resources on the landscape, and really don't have that connection to these animals like we do. Again, incidents with large dogs occur primarily in that late winter to early spring, during that mating, denning, and pupping season. One behavior that we see and hear of, which is very common for the coyote, is called an escort behavior. So if you imagine a den site behind the creek here, and there's a coyote with pups in there, and this person's walking their dog, coyotes will come out and actually follow you down the trail in an escort behavior. So what they're doing is they're escorting the people and the potential conflict situation and or predator away from their den site. They're just making sure that that dog isn't going to turn around and come back and go after the pups that are in that den. It's common to feel that these animals are stalking, like they're stalking you, but it is not predatory behavior. It's actually a defensive behavior. So again, dogs and coyotes, they're like cartoon nemesis. Here's an image of feeding a dog outside and having that human food resource or pet food out there, and the possibility for that negative interaction between those two animals. So different ways to keep your pets safe. Create barriers. Fences with overhangs are a great way to exclude coyotes. They can't quite understand how to navigate jumping over that overhang. Coyote roller bars are another great solution. You can put these on smaller fences, like 4-foot to 6-foot fences. When the coyotes put their paws up there, that bar rolls backwards and they can't make it over the top. It's very effective, and a great way to exclude these animals from your backyard or from a property where you're seeing coyotes moving around quite a bit. Again, another solution is electric fencing. Again, highly recommended for a lot of the wildlife species that we have out here. If done correctly, it can be very effective, and again, it's not lethal. So let's jump into human hazing. So what do you do if you see a coyote? And this isn't necessarily an encounter, but just if you see a coyote in general. So again, these animals are highly adaptive. Unfortunately, people do feed them, and so we want to reestablish that natural fear of people by doing a couple things. So be noisy, be loud, Get an air horn, put it by the back door. If you see a coyote in your backyard, it's a great opportunity to go take a quick picture and then blast that air horn at it, yell at it, tell it to get out of there, to again reinstill that natural fear of people. Other noise makers that are really effective are rock shakers. So basically you just get a soda can, fill it about a third of the way with rocks, and you just shake that. And again, you want to yell. These animals understand that association with people are negative. And so by yelling and having that rock shaker, that coyote is going to understand that that is not a great place for them to hang out. Pots and pans, always a good choice. For just making lots of loud noise. If you don't have those tools or those items, look big, wave your jacket in the air, pick up some sticks, shake those, bang those together. If you're working out in the yard, you have a trowel and a rake, bang those together, stand up, just make yourself look big. If the coyote is moving closer to you or approaching you, act aggressively, really yell at those animals. Let them know that they're not welcome there. Squirt water. Water is a great tool. You can, use the hose, turn the sprinklers on if they're out in your yard. And there are also motion activated sprinklers that are a great tool, and I highly recommend them for coyotes. Basically, you just attach this motion activated device to a sprinkler, and when the animal walks in front of it, they just get a blast of water. It just kind of scares them and they get out of there. If the coyotes still aren't leaving, throw stuff at them. If they're just in your backyard doing what coyotes do, don't try to hit them. We're not trying to hurt these guys. But throw tennis balls, throw sticks in their direction, throw some rocks in their direction. Try to scare them off your property. And so what do you do if a coyote approaches you? So this is where, the first thing is don't run. Never run if a coyote approaches you. Just like a dog, that canine reaction to run after the thing that's running away from you. It's same thing with coyotes. It just triggers that chase response. So don't run from coyotes. Stand your ground. Be aggressive. Wave your arms. Stomp your feet. Shout. Throw rocks. Grab sticks. Again, be aggressive, reinstill that fear of people. It's a great way of, again, humanely hazing these animals. Appear as large as possible. And I love this photo of my boss, lifting up his jacket. Anything strange to a coyote that's big and scary, behaviors or items that are uncomfortable to them will really help scare them away from that situation. So, although very rare, again, we are not on the menu, neither are kids. But if a coyote is approaching your kids, pick the children up. Small dogs, pick the small dogs up off the ground. And same thing, be big, stand up, raise your arms, be mean, stomp on the ground, yell, 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 and teach your kids this as well. So if your kids are out playing in the backyard and they see a coyote, teach them to be big, teach them to be mean, and teach them to be loud. If they're out there and they're yelling, go away, coyote, you're going to hear them yell coyote. Your neighbors are going to hear them yell coyote. And that's going to bring a parent out of the house or a neighbor, to that situation. So yelling, go away, coyote, provides really good situational awareness for any adults that may be in the area. And again, really emphasize to kids that, don't run from coyotes. Be big, be mean, be loud, and yell, go away, coyote. So when it comes to trapping and removal of coyotes, it is an option, but it's also often very inhumane for those animals. We do not translocate coyotes for concern of diseases primarily, as well as exhibiting that same conflict behavior, just in another location. So if we trap a conflict coyote and we move it 70 miles away, and that animal is already habituated to human food resources, it is very likely that it's going to exhibit that same behavior. Trapping and removing coyotes is only a temporary solution. Often there are coyotes probably not very far away, and they're going to reoccupy that space. So it's not a long-term solution, to whatever conflict that you're experiencing or people are experiencing. We really recommend that humane hazing tactics that we just talked about to really reinstill that fear of people, and managing attractants like we talked about a little bit earlier. So again, bird feed, garbage, pet food, those are the top three that we see. There's also concern with trapping wildlife, especially seasonality. We don't want to leave any orphans or juveniles on the landscape without their parents there. Coyotes are also very difficult to trap. They are extremely smart. They will not go into box traps or wire traps like this poor puppy did. And leg hold traps are very inhumane. They can be inhumane if not properly monitored and managed, as well as the concern for bycatch. So somebody's dog, or some other animal stepping in that leg hold trap. So that's it for coyotes. We'll kind of wrap them up in a second, but we'll go through a little bit of information on raccoons. So raccoons are, all these animals are my favorite animals, but raccoons are just so charismatic and really interesting, very intelligent and highly adaptable animals, very similar to a coyote. So really happy to talk about them today. So raccoons are about 3 feet long. They weigh 15 to 40 pounds. And unlike the coyotes, with access to human food, they can become quite large. So they'll keep eating and keep getting bigger and bigger. Males, a 60-pound male raccoon is not uncommon in urban environments with access to easy human food resources. Again, that, high fat, high calorie intake. Raccoons are not great hunters, but they are great at eating some of the pests, what we would consider pest species. So some of the insect species that are around our gardens or around our houses. They also eat lots of fruits, seeds, birds, and bird eggs, garbage and pet food, again, especially in our urban areas. Raccoons are solitary. They don't have a mating partner like coyotes do. But when they do mate, they find a den site and they'll have 2 to 3 kits. So preventing conflict with raccoons is fairly simple. Exclusion goes a long way. So fencing and or barriers to keep these cute little critters out from under your deck or from an attic or crawl space, maybe under a shed in the backyard. Just putting up some type of barrier or fencing around those areas is very effective at keeping these animals out. They're I wouldn't say they're lazy, but they're not gonna put a ton of effort into removing those barriers to try to get into those spaces. Scare devices and repellents. There are plenty of tools out there. A couple that I use and recommend are motion activated alarms. So motion activated alarms, when the animal walks in front of it, it flashes a strobe light. It can play different sounds, including human sounds or ultrasonic noises. The animals may not run in fear from these motion activated alarms, but what it does is it dissuades them from wanting to hang out in those areas. Motion activated sprinklers are another really good option, or just a handheld hose for getting these guys out of an area or off your property. Relocation of raccoons is against the law due to primarily disease concerns, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. So when we're moving around the landscape, backyards, commercial properties, wherever you may be moving around, and know that or have seen raccoons in the area, look for latrines. So latrines are bathroom sites. So raccoons will only use the bathroom outside of their primary den site. Typically, those latrines, they'll continue to use those latrines over and over. So you're going to see little raccoon piles all over the place. When it comes to latrines, raccoons is very common for them to carry different diseases. So if you need to remove those latrine sites, we highly recommend PPE, so mask, gloves, eye protection, dispose of the gloves or any material that was there, double bagged in the trash can. And then we recommend just washing your clothes after that. And I should have added that at the end there. But some of the common diseases are roundworm, canine distemper, avian influenza, which is becoming more prevalent throughout some of our avian and mammal species in the Western United States or Washington here, leptospirosis. They do carry rabies, except terrestrial mammals, it's very uncommon to have rabies in those species in Washington here. So in any of those encounters, or if, for whatever reason, you do get a bite from either a coyote or a raccoon, never hesitate to call 911, after having that contact. For any kind of human-wildlife conflict or an attack, again, human contact, contact our WildCom dispatch or our police dispatch. I could get the number for you at the end here if you like, or I could put that into the chat for everyone to have. You're also welcome to call our front desk. Our primary location is in Mill Creek. Feel free to call our staff anytime. We're always happy to discuss the situation and next best steps. And if you are bit, call your physician. They may have recommendations on different vaccines and or wound care. So getting help in general for, living and coexisting with these animals, self-help. Look at our Living with Wildlife webpage, which I'll show you in just a second here. Again, call our front office. If it is a trap and removal situation, you can find wildlife control operators who are professional trappers. You can find their information on our Living with Wildlife webpage. If you see sick, injured, or orphaned animals on the landscape, contact a wildlife rehabilitator. Please give them a call before handling that animal. Especially right now as we look into spring, don't pick up orphaned or juvenile animals. Sometimes the parents are just moving around and it's not always necessary to grab them and take them to rehab. So if you do see sick, injured, or orphaned animals on the landscape, get the wildlife rehabbers a call before you handle those species. So here's our Living with Wildlife webpage. There's incredible resources on here. Basically, you can toggle through the different options below. You can find information on individual animals. So our dangerous wildlife would be, bear, cougar, wolf, moose. Nuisance wildlife would be, the coyotes and the raccoons. And again, there's excellent information on injured or orphaned wildlife. So just to kind of wrap up the presentation, I hope timing is okay. I could continue to chat longer if we need to, but just some final thoughts and last couple slides for you today. So this is a really amazing quote. Coyotes again are adapting to live with us. So the first step is to recognize that this is not a coyote problem. It's a people problem. Every human encounter that ends with a meal for a coyote is a lesson to that intelligent coyote that humans equal food. So again, please have a look around your property, share with neighbors. Keep in mind that humane hazing. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. The best option for living with these animals and reducing conflict is coexistence. Again, removal of one animal is not a solution to the problem. The solution is to manage some of those attractants, hazing animals, removing or excluding them from den sites or under structures. And it takes a big cultural shift. It takes an entire neighborhood to really reduce human wildlife conflict for a lot of these little critters. These animals are here to stay. Again, they provide excellent ecosystem services for us by managing some of those smaller pests, and we want to do our best to try to reduce that human wildlife conflict component there. A couple other just awesome resources if you'd like to continue to learn about coyotes in our urban environments. One is the Seattle Coyote Project, which is a diet study for coyotes in the greater Seattle area. There's great community involvement with this, with identifying individual animals, deceased or sample opportunities, and just great ways to get involved. There's also excellent information on what our local coyotes are eating. So they're looking at what their primary food resources are in these very urban environments. Oops. Another great resource is the Woodland Park Zoo, is the Coexisting with Carnivores webpage. They have excellent information on avoiding conflicts, not feeding wildlife, and have done amazing proactive efforts on education for coexisting with these species. So that's it for my presentation. I think I got a little bit more time here, so I'm happy to continue to chat, Kate, or we can answer some questions, or how are we looking there?
That was awesome. There are actually a lot of questions coming
Sure.
in the Q&A, so perfect that you ended just a couple minutes early. I mean, given that it's an hour-long presentation, I would say you did it. You nailed it right on time. For the record, that's my opinion.
Just a quick note that, so Anastasia said that in that photo that you had of the birds behind that coyote, that was California quail. I was like, is that a
good to know? That's really good to know.
ptarmigan? Is it a pheasant? I don't know. So
yeah,
she had an answer for us there. I just found it interesting. I'll say real quick that expansion map that you showed of European expansion in the West, it really highlighted, as people filled the area, that coyotes also expanded there, and kind of goes to your point of, us providing the food. So first question we have here, do coyotes exist significantly in more higher elevation and wild areas like where the Cascade fox might be? Do they coexist, compete, and hybridize?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So coyotes will primarily stay in lower elevation environments where those food resources are more available or more abundant. They do live in high elevation, but they're going to stay in those meadows and or river valleys. In higher densities, coyotes will be out of the snow line. And again, our human urban environments are excellent habitat for coyotes and just an abundance of food resources. But yeah, coyotes, there's coyotes all over the mountains, throughout the western states here. And they do and can occupy those same spaces as some of those fox species.
It's funny, as soon as you said that, I'm trying to picture coyotes in the snow. I don't know if I've ever even seen a picture. How do they do in the snow?
They do pretty well. I mean, there's still plenty of food for them. Squirrels, different rabbit species. They are not as specialized as the Sierra Nevada red fox, for example.
Yeah.
They will still have access to some of those animals, And they're gorgeous in the snow. They have, you know, tons of beautiful fur and that winter coat that comes out. And yeah, they do great in snowy environments.
So does that answer this next question? Do coyotes prefer urban spaces versus forested?
You know, I couldn't say if there's a preference for them. We do find them, you know, both, you know, in wildland areas as well as our urban environments. We may find them in higher densities in our urban environments. And anecdotally, we may just see them more in our urban environments where we are not seeing them as frequently in those wildland areas. And there could be a couple reasons why. You know, one is just you know, coyotes in wild areas are not habituated to people. They have a more natural fear of people. In our urban environments, you know, they're moving around. You know, every morning as we're going to work and every day as we're coming home. You know, we're also seeing them more frequently on cameras. You know, we all have Ring cameras nowadays, and you know, on our houses or game cameras, you know, in our backyards. And so we tend to see or classify that as increased frequency of sightings, when actually they've always been there. We just have more cameras on the landscape. And to add to that, you know, in our urban environments, we also have social media platforms. So if you know, one person sees a coyote or has an incident, that goes on some of these social media platforms, which is great to discuss, you know, and provide accurate education like humane hazing. But it can seem like we are experiencing or seeing these animals more often, and or having an increase in frequency of those negative interactions, which you know, I think it just comes down to, you know, technology and you know, ease of communication nowadays.
Right. So, on a very different subject, which is fascinating though, coy dogs and coy wolf hybrids, how common?
Coy dogs and coy wolf hybrids. So they do hybridize. You know, I don't have a ton of information on that. I would say not as much as we actually think.
Right.
There's often a you know, a human element that keeps these species separate. And again, uh, you know, dogs and coyotes, they just don't get along most of the time. So the likelihood of any kind of intersex breeding there is, you know, less likely. But there are, you know, there are research projects out there that do show that, you know, some coyotes do have a small percent of domestic dog in them. So
Right.
yeah.
So there's some star-crossed loving going on there. Uh, so, okay, when you get calls, I think you kind of answered this. So we don't relocate coyotes. Is it the same like with raccoons where it's illegal, or is it just kind of unethical? The question was about relocating from urban areas.
Yeah, so coyotes fall into this really unique position in the state of Washington. So they are not a game species, and they are not, you know, classified as like a nuisance wildlife. They're actually an unclassified species,
Wow.
which basically means that they're common and they're not managed like some of our you know, deer, elk, bear, and they are I guess a little bit more charismatic than some of the smaller mammals that are out there. So it is not illegal to translocate coyotes, but it is just more inhumane for that animal to do so.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Someone is asking about if you've been to Point Defiance and seen that like Raccoon Row. I haven't actually seen it, but I've watched video of this where the raccoons come out and there's video of them just, you know, begging on their like hind legs. And it's not really a question. It's more just a comment about, you know, that habituation.
Yeah. No, I actually haven't seen that, but I'm gonna Google that as soon as we're off the call here.
It's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, it's cute to see their little hands doing that, but it's, yeah, it's.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, you know, coyotes and raccoons are highly plastic, very adaptable to our urban environments. and can be heavily habituated with access to human food resources. So it is sad. It really does have negative consequences for those animals. Whether it be health issues, vehicle collision, they become habituated, and you may not trap them, but your neighbor might trap them. So feeding wildlife, it's just it's always sad for the animals.
Okay, well, here's one that it interests me. Do coyotes use dens year round, or is it only during that pupping season? And if it's the latter, will intact dens generally be reoccupied in future seasons?
Yeah, that's a good question. So they only occupy that den site during that late winter spring time frame, but they will reoccupy those den sites the following year and or choose new den sites. One thing that may increase, going back to the coyote sighting conversation, there is just human activities. So if we're altering the landscape, we may actually push those coyotes away from their den spaces that they do like to occupy, and kind of pushing them out to find less preferable den sites. So.
Right. Okay, well, thank you so much. I think we'll stop there. Any other questions? If you have time, if you're interested in perusing these, Kevin, and to answer. Some of these are more just kind of commentary about people's observations. But thank you so much for your time and your information. I loved it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks
that
everyone for having me. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
was fantastic. Thank you so much, Kevin. I'm so excited to introduce our last speaker for today's webinar, Nikki Desatels, regarding one of the most misunderstood groups of mammals on Earth, which are bats. And she will be speaking about their role in pest and disease control, pollination, and seed dispersion. So a little bit about Nikki. She's a naturalist and an educator focused on bat conservation. She holds a master's degree in science communications and public engagement from Miami University. She also currently serves as the president of the board of directors at Bats Northwest, which is a local nonprofit dedicated to welfare of bats in the Pacific Northwest. She is also the author of an upcoming book called For the Love of Bats, which will be published by the Mountaineers Books in October of this year. So welcome, Nikki, and I look forward to learning all about bats.
Awesome.
I love bats.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk to this group in particular about a little bit all bats, but mostly our Washington bat species. And so my goal today is going to kind of help people understand who these animals are, what their true behaviors are. There's so many myths, misconceptions, and just like misinformation out there when it comes to bats. And then we're definitely going to dive into our local bat behavior, habitats, what they do for us, and what we can kind of do to keep their populations at the levels we want them at. So this should be a lot of fun. Thank you for the introduction. It sounds like she already introduced Bats Northwest. Bats Northwest has been in the Puget Sound area since the mid-90s, doing exactly what I just talked about, trying to educate the public and our communities with the real information about bats and their importance in our world. So we're kind of the only bat conservation organization in the Pacific Northwest. So while we started here in Seattle, we really do kind of cover all of the Pacific Northwest in terms of our reach out and answering questions and helping people with conflicts with bats. So let's get started. All right, so first thing I always like to talk to people about bats is just the vast diversity of bats that actually exist on Earth. Most people don't realize that we have so many species, but bats are our only group of flying mammals. They are mammals just like us, and that everything that goes with being mammals, warm-blooded for live birth, nursing their babies. But across the world, there are over 1,500 species of bats that we have now found and discovered. And the interesting is that number is still growing, as it is in a lot of animal groups. But we're finding new species all the time. And so bats are present across the world on almost every continent except Antarctica. And in almost every type of habitat, from the driest deserts to our forests to the wet rainforests and the neotropics, and just in every type of habitat imaginable, they have a different ecological but very important role. So that's around the world. Here in Washington, we have 14 species. Our largest bat is a bat called the hoary bat, which is named for the little white hair tips it has, frosted tips, I mean, is what hoary means. And in terms of biggest bats, they only have a wingspan of about 16 inches and they weigh less than half an ounce. So we're not talking very big bats here. That being said, we also have bats that are extremely small here in Western Washington. That can be our California Coyotes, our little brown bats, which have wingspans closer to 7 to 8 inches across. And on the eastern side of the state, we have an even smaller bat, the canyon bat, whose wingspan is more 5 to 6 inches. And they're so small that sometimes they're mistaken for moths. But we'll talk a lot more about Washington species in particular a little bit later. All right, so a couple of basics about bats biology that are kind of important to a lot of people. There's a lot of fear in the world of bats. They have an erratic flight. They're really good at night, nocturnal animals. So they're tend to be seen as a little startling and erratic. So bats actually fly a lot different than birds. Of course, being mammals, they have a fairly mammalian bone structure and skeleton. The big difference you're going to see there is that they have much longer, more robust arm bones than a lot of mammals. And then they have these huge elongated fingers. And so bats belong to the order Chiroptera. So they're not part of the rodent family, which is another common myth, but they're in their own scientific group. And Chiroptera comes from an ancient Greek word that means chiro, like chiropractor, so hand, and ptera, like pterodactyl, for flying. So bats actually fly with their hands. And the reason that's so important, that instead of flapping and gliding through the air like birds, they tend to more like swim and pull themselves through the air. And instead of having just 3 points of movement, a shoulder, elbow, and wrist, again, like a bird, they have 15 points of movement by using those fingers to fly. And so each of those knuckle bones that we have, they have as well. They have an incredibly dexterous finger. So it allows them to twist and turn, following the flight usually of insects in a really erratic but acrobatic way, if you get to see it. And so that kind of is a good thing to keep in mind in terms of how they move and how they're structured. So those wings actually stretch from the index finger all the way down to the pinky and then connect at their ankles. So their leg bones are also part of the flight movement when they're flying. So why it matters that we understand that they're part of the Chiroptera family instead of the rodent family. A lot of people who don't know a ton about bats often equate them to rodents and all of the characteristics that rodents have. And in fact, they're very, very different. In fact, in the evolutionary chain, bats have been around for about 65 million years. So right after the age of the dinosaurs. And they've been largely the same in terms of their biology. Of course, they've shifted and changed a little over that extreme amount of time, but not as much as you would think. Even 40,000 years ago, we found mummified bats that are almost identical to the species we have now in the Western United States. And so our bats have been around and active in these environments longer than most of our mountain ranges. The Cascades themselves are only 5 million years old. So quite a bit different. So the reason it's so important that we understand that they're different and that they are not even evolved from the same mammals. A huge one that people misattribute to bats are that gnawing and chewing that rodents have to do to keep their front teeth down, which allows them to chew their way into buildings or create nests or tunnel. Because bats' adaptations are all for flight, they don't actually have a mechanism to create their own roost, to create their own living areas. And so they're purely opportunistic. Their jaws are designed for catching insects, not for chewing or causing damage in that way. So they need to find openings that already exist. They need to find abandoned animal homes. They need to find, and we'll talk a lot more about where they roost in this area. But that kind of destructiveness that is kind of thought of with rodents is not a trait that bats share. In fact, like I said, they don't even build their own roosts. They don't use nests, they use roosts. They have to find things that are already available on the landscape. And they can get quite creative. They are very opportunistic and smart, but they're not going to be creating damage to find a spot that they're going to use. Reproductive rates is another one that's very different than rodents. We think of rodents as kind of short lives, lots of reproduction, able to have multiple litters throughout a year to grow their populations. Bats are actually the complete opposite of that. They are the longest lived animals for their size and the slowest reproducing animals for their size. And so bats, while a rodent may live 2 to 4 years, maybe a little bit longer depending on the species, around here especially, bats' lifespans are closer to maybe 7 to 12 years on the low end and 30 to 40 years on the high end. So they're very long-lived species. And as a reflection of that, they're very slow reproducing. Bats tend to have 1 pup per year. We have a couple of species in Washington that may have twins, and one that can sometimes have triplets, but those bats live in much more exposed lifestyles where not all of the young will survive. And so that's a really important distinction, especially when you're coming across colonies or encountering bats in buildings. The time it takes for a lost colony to reproduce and reestablish is exponentially longer than it would be in rodents. All right, so in addition to flight, bats of course use echolocation. Most people know and understand that. What a lot of people don't realize is that doesn't actually mean that they are blind as species. Their eyes are small, but they actually have about as good an eyesight as you and I do. It's just geared towards something slightly different. Part of that is being able to see in low light. The other part of that is using their sight to see structures and contrast on the landscape. So while they do use sound, ultrasonic sound that is generally above our range of hearing to navigate, to search for food, and to capture food, they are using their eyesight and in some cases their sense of smell to navigate across the landscape, to migrate, to search out water sources. And so it's a combination of all those things that help them thrive and survive. And so here in Washington, all of our bats echolocate. We have smaller bats that use higher echolocation to seek out and forage on smaller insects. And then we have some slightly larger, like the hoary bat, who use a lower echolocation that occasionally those of us with really good hearing can hear bits of. But they're going to be flying higher and seeking out larger food sources like beetles and moths and things like that. Just a little breather as we go through all the biology. I wanted to show you guys this video. This is a slow motion video of a bat capturing moths in flight. We call that aerial foraging. Most bats have one of 2 different styles of foraging. Aerial foraging means they're seeking out and capturing night flying insects, which they do a lot of. But we also have bats that are gleaners, and that means they use less of their echolocation and more of their large ears and excellent hearing to listen for sounds of insects and pluck them off of surfaces such as leaves, branches, bushes, the ground, or anything else that more resting insects that aren't flying may be using. And so this bat here is likely a species called a red bat, which we don't have in Washington, but it's nearly identical to our hoary bats that we were looking at earlier. And so I'm just going to show this, and it has slowed down echolocation so that we can hear what that would sound like if it was audible to us, as well as a really good example about the different ways that bats use those highly dexterous hand wings and tail membranes when they're foraging. So I love that video because it shows us so much of what bats are really doing when they're out there flying around in the sky, things that we can't see from our perspective. You can kind of see how those hand wings and even their tail membranes are such a big assist in capturing. It's why bats have such a high capture rate. Bats are, in fact, the #1 predator of night-flying insects, which is when a lot of our pest insects are out, and have incredibly high capture rates because they can use so much more than just their mouths to capture their prey. They're also very opportunistic, as we'll continue to talk about, and flexible in terms of the prey that they're looking at based on abundance, based on outbreaks, based on all sorts of things that really do help our natural habitats. So before we get into the kind of bulk of what I want to talk about today, a couple more myths and misconceptions. A big one with bats, of course, is disease. And there we go. And of course, a lot of times when talks of bats come up, talks of rabies come up. So here in Washington, the only species that does generally have a rabies virus in the population is our bats. So that's really fortunate compared to the places like the East Coast that will also have to be worried about foxes and skunks and some other animals. But here it is mainly bats. That being said, it is incredibly rare. Back in the, before the 1950s, before we had regular vaccines for our dogs and cats, we generally had 25 plus cases of rabies in the United States and Canada per year. Since that time, when we've started vaccinating domestic animals, that rate has gone down to just 2 to 3 cases per year, though it is generally in bats. So in most bat populations, just bats that are out doing their normal bat thing, anywhere in the United States, the rate of rabies is less than 1%. So it is very uncommon. Bats do not just carry rabies and pass it on. They are mammals. They can, if they contract rabies, they go through the process of any other mammal. They will get sick and die. The point in which rabies becomes more of a concern for people is when you find bats on the ground or immobile somewhere that they don't actually belong. But even in that case, there are so many other reasons that bats are flying during the day, are found on the ground, are roosting somewhere unusual and don't move on the same night, that even then the rate of rabies it still goes up to less than 10% of found bats that are already having an issue. And so we'll talk about some of the other reasons that you can sometimes find a bat. So having bats in the environment, having a bat house near a population of people, none of those are increased risk for rabies. The only way to actually contract rabies is to get bit or scratched by a bat. And with the advances in medication we have now, it is very, very easy and practical to go and get your post-exposure shots. So if you do ever have an encounter with a bat that involves a bite or a scratch, seek medical attention. It's like getting a flu shot. Very simple, not nearly the stories we hear about from what it used to entail several decades ago. So the other thing people sometimes worry about is histoplasmosis, which is, of course, a fungus in guano or feces. There has not been a recorded case of histoplasmosis from bats in Washington. That being said, dealing with any fecal matter, I think you guys probably heard a lot about this with raccoons in particular, but dealing with any fecal matter, you're not going to want to handle it without gloves. You're going to want to wear respirators if you're in a spot with a lot. So the nice thing about guano with bats is it's an excellent fertilizer. So if you guys do have a colony or a bat house somewhere, you can mix that into other fertilizers and have very, very happy plants. So just being safe and cautious and never dealing with bats without gloves, all those logical things with wildlife is enough to protect yourself from anything that may come with bats. All right, so let's switch to Washington State a little bit. I mentioned there are 14 species of bats here in the state. 4 of those species are only found east of the Cascades in the more semi-arid, arid habitats that have a lot of tall cliff faces and big rock crevices. The other 10 are either statewide or found in Western Washington. Here in Seattle, bats are very adaptable. We do have some sensitive species that are not found in urban areas, but we have a lot of bats who have adapted to human environments as we continue to develop land in their spaces. And so we have one of the ways you can track bat populations, less populations, but presence, is by using bioacoustics. So these are recorders that record ultrasonic sound and can actually record their echolocation calls. And then as bats are echolocating, they have kind of an identifying call that we can use to identify them by species using both the frequency and the call patterns. And so we have one of those at Woodland Park Zoo, which is pretty central to downtown Seattle, like right here in the city, in the north end of the city. And so at that detector over the last 5 years, we have recorded 7 of those 10 species that are found here in Western Washington, passing through or staying for a long time. So this map kind of shows the different species that have been found at the zoo, and then when they're most commonly there. So we're going to talk about the life cycle of bats here, but you can kind of see that in those summer months is when we get the majority of all of these species, but you'll even see that there are a couple that are active in the winter that we'll talk about. And so that means that our habitats, our parks, our forests, our suburban neighborhoods, our urban areas are all bat habitat if we're able to provide some of those things that bats need to survive. And so we'll talk about what that is. I mentioned this earlier, but it's one of the things people are most surprised about bats, so that's why I kind of pulled it out. So that lifespan I was talking about, 12 to 40 years, is very species dependent. And life spans are a little bit longer in bats that hibernate, which the majority of our species here in Washington do. So that's why it can be long. Our smallest bats are the ones that actually have the longest lifespans. Our little brown bats in particular have been captured, and our Myotis bats have been captured up to 30 or 40 years after being initially tagged. So we do know that they live a really long time. All right, here in Washington, our bats are most active from spring to about mid-fall. The reason for that is pretty simple. They're all insect-eating bats here in Washington, and so that means that when flying insects go dormant, our bats are going to have a really hard time meeting their diet needs. And so, in the off season for that, so starting in late September, mid-October, our bats are going to be moving either to migrate south for the winter, which we do have a couple of species that are long distance migrators. The majority of them are looking for places to hibernate. And so March and April, when we start to see insects again, when temperatures get into the 40s and 50s, our bats are going to start waking up. They're going to come out and start feeding again on those insects, making up for the lost food stores that they lose during hibernation, and preparing for the birth of their pups for that year. And so female bats actually emerge from hibernation first so that they can get a head start on eating all those things and traveling back to their summer grounds, which could be, you know, anywhere from dozens to a few hundred miles from where they're hibernating. Female bats will then start forming reproductive female only maternity colonies. So here in Washington, we don't have the large colonies of bats that you sometimes think of when you think of Texas or California or other parts of the world where thousands to millions of bats will be roosting in the same cave or bridge. Here, our largest colonies tend to be our maternity colonies over the summer. And they are generally in the dozens to a few hundred. Very occasionally, we'll find one in the upper hundreds or as many as 1,000 to 2,000, but that's generally on the east side of the state and only a couple of species that do that. So they'll form their maternity colonies, and unlike most of the rest of our wildlife, who has kind of the like spring wildlife baby season, like our bunnies and our coyotes, bats are actually timing their births for the highest insect abundance. And so the highest insect abundance is generally in the hottest part of the summer. And so our bats are going to be having their young in late June and in July instead of in the springtime. So they raise their young in June, July, and August. Young are born very big. That one pup, the reason they have one pup is a lot of times that pup is going to be born at 25 to 35% of mom's body weight when they're born. They are born like all mammals. They're naked, their eyes are closed, their ears are down, but they do have very strong back legs at that point so that they can attach to mom and hold on. Only a few species regularly fly with their pups, but this is one of those reasons we occasionally find bats on the ground. For the bats that do carry their pups, that's a very big baby. And so if mom hasn't been getting the food or hydration she needs, she can end up what we call grounded, which is stuck on the ground because of that extra weight from the baby. Especially our bats that have twins, or even the one that occasionally has triplets, like that's a lot of weight they're carrying. So sometimes in the spring, bats will be found on the ground, or in the summer, bats will be found on the ground carrying their pups. In the spring, the most likely reason we find bats on the ground or stuck somewhere is if they've emerged from hibernation and don't yet have the energy to fly. Flying takes so much energy and calories that occasionally, if they're undernourished or dehydrated and haven't been able to replenish those stores quickly enough, they can wear themselves out during their short migrations and end up on the ground in need of help. And so that would be, both of those times would be times to call a wildlife rehabilitator and try to get that bat into care if possible. Okay, so they're born at about a third mom's body weight. At this point in the life cycle, female bats are pretty much from pregnancy through the end of nursing. They're eating 70 to 100% of their body weight in insects every single night. So it's quite a lot of foraging that they have to do, which is why they need that high abundance and why they're so careful to time pregnancies to make sure that that happens. So the pups are going to grow from that 1/3 mom size to 90% of their full grown skeletal growth in 3 to 5 weeks, because that's how long they have before they need to be figuring out echolocation and foraging on their own, so that they can accompany mom or fly on their own, depending on the species, back towards those hibernation grounds by fall. And so they have a very short window, because they're born so late in the summer, to be able to grow, learn, and build up fat stores for the coming winter. It's a very, very tight timeline for all of our bats. And so in 3 to 5 weeks, those pups are going to be taking test flights outside the roost, the maternity roost. They're going to be figuring out echolocation. They're going to be building their mental maps of where their colony is, and they're going to be starting to forage. And so they will nurse through all of those experiments for quite a while until they're able to feed themselves out on their own. And so depending on the species at that point, either mom and pups together will head back towards hibernation grounds or out to migrate, or some species, moms will leave early and head back towards hibernation areas while the pups remain in the colony and continue to fine-tune their flight, echolocation, and foraging skills. All right, so bats are unusual in that they mate in the fall. So we kind of did this backwards. We talked about getting pregnant and having pups first, but how did they get pregnant? They were mating in the fall. So a lot of bats don't become sexually reproductive until their second or third seasons. Because of that long lifespan, they're kind of able to do that. And so mating tends to happen either on long distance migration for the species that are traveling long distances, or around the sites that they're going to be hibernating in. So a lot of bats in Washington will move towards the foothills of the Cascades. Not all of them, but there's a lot we don't know about hibernation and migration. But what we do know is we do have a lot of bats that kind of move towards these sites. And as they're kind of checking out different places where they could hibernate for the winter, they're also engaging in mating practices then. And so females will show up. Bats here are largely promiscuous. The males only have a role in mating. Females work together through everything else. Those maternity colonies I mentioned are also often multi-generational matriarchal colonies. So when a female pup, a daughter, becomes sexually reproductive, she will often join mom's maternity colony, and so on and so on and so on. Until that colony either gets too big for the space and has to split, or is displaced in some way and has to find a new home. So mating will happen. Females will show up and mate for a little while, a few days usually, and then go straight into hibernation, because remember that they wake up earlier in the spring so that they can get going on pregnancy and raising their pups. Males will stay out longer to continue to mate and go into hibernation, and often will have to continue foraging because they spend a lot of energy in their mating pursuits before going into hibernation later, and then arousing later in the spring because they don't have anything to do all summer except eat, which is great. Males and non-reproductive females tend to eat between about 25 and 50% of their body weight a night, so still a lot of food. And then for our bats that haven't gone south so that they can remain active in the winter, the rest of our bats do go into hibernation as it gets cold. This is usually by November, with the exception of 2 species we have here in the Puget Sound area. Because it's pretty mild here, especially like this summer or this winter, we do have 2 species that remain partially active. Our California Myotis, which is a very small brown bat with darker wings, and our silver-haired bat, which is a slightly bigger but still small chocolate bat with very long hairs and little silver tips on the end. Those 2 bats are seen fairly frequently in the winter, so they will arouse from their hibernation, or they use more short-term hibernation, which we call torpor, which is the actual act of lowering your body temperature and your metabolic rate and conserving energy. So they'll wake up more frequently when the weather gets warm enough for them to go out and look for food. Like I said, our flying insects need about mid-40s to low 50s in temperatures to be active and flying. And so there are insects that hatch over the winter. And so these 2 bat species will remain active enough to capitalize on those warmer nights. And we do sometimes see them or hear from people that there are bats out in the winter, and it's usually those 2 species. So everyone else is going to go into hibernation until that shift in the spring. All right. So why are bats so important around here? I'm sure most people know they contribute to pest control. I don't know if they know how much. And so I mentioned earlier that bats are the #1 predator of night flying insects. That is because, you know, they evolved being nocturnal. There's a lot fewer birds out. There's a lot fewer competition for resources. And the majority of our insects are nocturnal, particularly insects like moths and some beetles and things like that. And so in the US, they've done enough studies to know that bats save farmers an average of $23 billion a year in pest control services. So that can range anywhere from like 3 to 50 billion, depending on, of course, the season and the conditions and a lot of other factors. So they're a huge impact on our agriculture services, our food sources, but this goes beyond agriculture fields to include pests in forests and in other areas, mosquitoes, in our urban areas and in our wet areas. And so they're really preying on everything at night and helping us in so many different ways, not only reducing the need for pesticides, saving crops from damage, increasing yield. So they're really doing a lot for us. Because they're such opportunistic foragers, like I mentioned, they're known to track insect fluctuations. And so they can adjust either their foraging style, like those who specialize in aerial hawking, like I was mentioning, can do gleaning when the food is available, and vice versa. So those that generally glean can certainly start catching some night flying insects when there's a huge abundance. And so a lot of times bats in their echolocation have a specific type of call they use when they're foraging and capturing insects, and that we call a feeding buzz can be heard by other bats and will actually bring bats into an area if there's an abundance of food in one place. So while they may have a specific habitat or environment that they're living within, they can certainly move generally throughout the area to capture an outbreak, or if a hatch happens where a bunch of insects emerge from the water at once, or if an insect migration is coming through, they're going to capitalize on all of those different things, which makes them really beneficial. And so they really do control insect populations by feeding on those adults and controlling where eggs are laid, places where mosquitoes are really common. When bats are present, the amount of egg laying reduces significantly. So we've seen a lot of these different impacts that they have on the environment. All right, so just a few specifics. Like I mentioned, they can eat anywhere from 25 to 100% of their body weight in insects every night, depending on what stage of their life cycle are. Even the males and non-reproductive females are going to increase that amount of insects they eat when they're prepping for hibernation or just emerging in the spring or have some need to replenish their resources. And we already talked about aerial hawking and gleaning, so I'm going to skip over that. 2/3 of all bat species on Earth, of those 1,500 we mentioned, are insectivores. So this is the main thing that bats do around the world. And here in Washington, 100% of our bats are insectivores. And so The smallest bats can help us control the smaller insects. The bigger bats take on the bigger insects. And so we have a really nice variety, which is why it's so great to find 7 different species, even within the Seattle area, because it shows how many different species who are filling different niches each of our habitats can support. So something like an urban area can support 3/4 of our Western species in Western Washington. That says even better things for forests and for rural lands and for, you know, gardens and orchards and agricultural areas. All right. So the importance of bats was recently shown in a case study that came out last year. It was a really interesting one. One of the big threats that is facing bats in the United States right now is something called white nose syndrome. It's a fungus that causes a fatal syndrome in hibernating bats. It's been hugely devastating on the East Coast, and it has been on the West Coast in Washington since 2016, and so we're certainly seeing effects. There was recently a study done in Chicago where white nose has been even longer than in Washington. And it looked at counties where they'd had a large bat population. The syndrome had come through, which is capable of killing up to 90% of the population, 97% of the population in some hibernation sites. And so they had a huge drop in their bat population. And so they looked at the same counties afterwards that were very agricultural heavy to see what the difference and impact was with the loss of that natural pest control. So those areas in the study saw a 31% increase in the use of pesticides in the years where those bats after they had been decimated. And they were able to track that through water sources and using guidelines set up by the World Health Organization to show that the increase in the pesticide use, which will of course leach into waters and foods and, you know, things that we humans interact with on a daily basis, correlated with an 8% increase in infant mortality in those areas. And so that natural pest control that bats provide is so essential not only to our food health, but to our direct health as humans. All right, so looking at some other areas that bats protect through their natural pest control, orchards are also a big one that gets looked at a lot. Bats protect orchards by consuming the adult insects before they're able to lay their eggs, and those larvae are able to damage the food crops. They also glean those caterpillars directly off of the leaves and branches, which can be super helpful if they're, you know, exposed caterpillars. So it protects the overall yield. There was a study done in one apple orchard that found a 50% reduction in damaged apples where bats were active versus some places where they were not active or were intentionally excluded so that they could do the study. And so that's protecting the overall yield of the food being produced, which is excellent. Worldwide, that same number has been shown at about 1/3. So whether you're looking at corn or cotton or rice, or pecans or apples, it's been shown that bats protect about 1/3, or they increase the yield for that year by about 1/3, which is great when you're talking about food products. And of course, the reduced damage in the apples and in the trees reduces the amount of toxins and fungus that can go in and increase that damage. So go bats. And that impact can be really bad or really big. Of course, this study also isn't in Washington. We haven't had the funding and ability to do a lot of research on these exact things specific to Washington, but 150 big brown bats, which is not a large colony by most standards, has been shown to prevent 33 million rootworms. So the larvae, 33 million of the larvae in 1 year just by preying on the adults. That same stat has been shown in corn down in Texas by preying on adult moths. And so it's a really important big piece of the puzzle that those larvae and eggs are not even laid. Okay, so here in Washington, our bats are a little bit different than what you think of on the East Coast with bats. And so because of the environment, especially here in Western Washington, almost all of our bats are in some way tied to trees and our forests. And so that kind of changes their behavior a little bit from what you regularly think. And so a lot of our bats, we don't have a lot of cave systems here, not a lot of limestone. We've got some lava tubes that are used incrementally, but we don't have anywhere like house large populations of bats. And so instead, a lot of our bats are either fairly solitary or moving in much smaller groups and forming much smaller colonies. And so trees are a big part of that. Trees are, most of our bats are obligate to trees in some part of their lifestyle or some part of their life cycle. And so that becomes incredibly important. Among our species, we kind of have 3 different roosting styles. One is what I call our foliage bats. So these are bats that literally roost in the open foliage of trees, both deciduous and evergreen trees. They'll find the tallest tree in a tree stand that gets the most sun. They'll find a side that's going to be really sunny and warm during the day, and they'll literally just roost among the leaves or needles, hanging upside down, wrapping themselves up, kind of camouflaged like a dried out pine cone or leaf. Those are foliage roosting bats, and so they tend to be much furrier with thick coats to protect them, and they're the ones that may have more than one pup in a year because they're raising them exposed in the branches of a tree. Our crevice roosting bats are a lot of our species here in Washington. So these are the bats that are looking for very tiny, small crevices to crawl into that they're not going to have to spend a lot of energy heating up because it's not a large space. They can crawl in individually or in small groups. And so in nature, this would be kind of cracks and crevices in trees caused by lightning or caused by tree rot. It might be under bark. It might be in rock crevices or on canyon faces. It could be under talus slopes. So crevice roosting bats have a lot of options. They're also the ones who have become more adapted to a lot of our man-made structures. So think of a crevice like underneath siding or under eaves. The cracks and spacing under bridges has become really popular with crevice roosting bats. So they have an opportunity to be pretty opportunistic because they're looking for more like size and space than they are a specific type of structure. But trees are also very common for them. And then our cavity roosting bats are a little more, we have a fewer species that are looking for that, but we do have some very sensitive species. And so these are species that prefer to find kind of an open area in something enclosed. So where we have more caves, these are definitely our cave roosting bats or lava tube roosting bats. But historically, they were also bats that would roost in the interiors of hollowed out trees, especially our old growth trees, which of course are much more rare on the landscape now. And so you'll sometimes find them using abandoned buildings, barns, or anywhere that they can kind of be indoors to have that good climate, but still have a little bit of open space so they can roost in the open. They tend to be very sensitive species to people's disturbances because they are roosting much more out in the open. All right, so as we talk about forests, I wanted to start with how bats benefit forests. And forests can also be tree stands, small forests, large forests, completely country forests, it doesn't really matter. So we talked a lot about pest control. Here are some of the more specific insects that they are known to prey upon, although I'm sure this is a very incomplete list because we need to do more diet studies here in Washington State for sure. But this is all the different ways that bats use trees. And so trees are essential to all of our species. Some of them are using trees as a navigational aid, especially when migrating, whether it's the short-term migration to hibernation or back, or the longer-term migration down into California, Arizona, or Mexico. They're often used as feeding perches. We have certain, especially the bats that glean food will often grab their food off a surface and then take it back to a nearby roost to consume it. We talked a little bit about how opportunistic bats are. So they're roosting in woodpecker holes, squirrel holes, cracks and crevices created by all sorts of natural elements. One of our foliage roosting bats, this is that hoary bat again, he's kind of popular today, roosting in a deciduous tree. So you can kind of see that they're going to be in spots that are surrounded by leaves, but have a bit of an opening underneath so that they can drop and fly away. That coloring where you can actually see the coloring on this bat doesn't work as well here, but if you can think of a pine tree, he could look like a pine cone, or if you think in the fall as the leaves change colors on this tree, you're going to have more of those like brown dry leaves that he's going to blend into really, really well. This is the same bat roosting on the bark of a tree. A lot of this white tip that we have on a couple of our different bats blends in really well with the lichen on a lot of the trees that we have in our area, or just in the patterning of the bark. In the winter, our silver-haired bats, which have a similar frosted tip to them, a little more sparse, will often be found in wood piles. That's very common. So lower down on the trees, there's still other places. We have species that will definitely roost underneath the bark, behind ivy, in those little rot holes where branches have fallen out. And then if we do have basal hollows, or those like nature-made hollowed out trees that you see in snags sometimes, we'll certainly find bats in those areas as well. I'm sure you guys know a lot about snags. Snags are the trees that are still, that have died but not fallen yet. These are wildlife trees for so many reasons and so many different species, but bats are definitely on that list. One of the things that bats really like about slowly decaying wood is that it lets off a little bit of heat, and is such a high energy use species. Anytime they don't have to generate their own internal heat and they can use something in the environment, even something as small as rotting wood, to warm an area so that they don't have to expend the energy, they're going to go to those areas. And so they really do like these slowly decaying trees because there's lots of holes and crevices that are created for them to roost in, but it's also a slightly warmer microclimate that helps save them energy. And so you'll sometimes find bats in places that emulate those same characteristics, such as rotting wood of an abandoned shed or barn or building. That's the same thing that draws bats to those areas. All right. So some of the things we can do for bats, once people learn about all the pest control services bats provide, they often ask, okay, well, how do I bring bats into my area? How do I attract bats? And while there's lots of weird things out on the horizon that may say it helps bring bats in, including bat houses, the reality is the only thing that brings bats into an area is good habitat. And so for bats, especially in Washington, really thinking about our trees and tree stands. So bats are less loyal to roost than people imagine them to be, and that's because they've kind of they've evolved with our forests and trees here in Western Washington. And so trees change too fast for a single tree to be something that they're loyal to, but they will be loyal to an area of trees or a stand of trees. And so if there's an age diversity in that tree, in those trees, if they can switch roosts easily, so bats here in Washington switch roosts quite frequently. Even maternity roosts have been known to change trees or locations fairly frequently. And a lot of that is to avoid pests to them, things like mites. It is because they need a certain microclimate. While they are warm-blooded like us, they are much more sensitive to ambient temperature. Because they use torpor, which is kind of what hummingbirds use to conserve energy, they can actually drop their body temperature and raise their body temperature a lot more than we can. And so in order to save energy, they're going to switch roosts. If their roost becomes too cold and they need to expend too much energy to stay warm, they're going to go look for a warmer place to sleep. If they're trying to go into torpor and save energy, then they may be looking for a cooler place to sleep. And so that's why a stand of trees that is really diverse and has different ages is going to give them a lot more options in terms of microclimates they can find. They can move from the one with the most sun exposure to somewhere with more shade to, something that is further into the tree or closer to the surface of that bark. And so having a stand of trees that are diverse allows bats to stay within the same general area instead of having to really move on to find new roosts. So that's really two really important things: the species diversity, age, and variety of trees. Bats, depending on their species, have different wing characteristics. Some of those make them incredibly agile, others will make them incredibly fast. And so depending on their agility in particular, they may be able to use a more densely treed area or need a more sparsely treed area. And so by thinning out forests to create space, it allows the understory to grow and increase the insect population so they have more food, but it also allows more species to use the area instead of only the ones who are really good agile flyers. So by opening that up, you'll get more bat species, which will prey on a larger variety of insects in your forest. And then, of course, retaining those snags and damaged trees and choosing native species are always important for their flying ability and for the diversity of insects that it brings in, which is going to, again, feed a larger diversity of bat species. The goal is not just to bring bats in, but it's to bring that diversity of species in so that all of our different prey options and pest options have predators. All right. The other piece of habitat for bats that can sometimes go unnoticed or unthought of is our water and watersheds. Obviously here in Western Washington in particular, but in Washington as a whole, we have a lot of water options. Most people don't realize that bats are very unique in that they actually prefer to drink on the wing. You'll almost never see a bat landing to get a drink unless they're really desperate, because bats are incredibly vulnerable on the ground. Because their skeletal system is designed to help empower flight, their hip bones are actually rotated, and their feet, so that they can roost properly and have their heads facing out to look for predators, their feet are actually backwards compared to ours. So they don't really have anything to create lift to get them off the ground. So for a bat to take flight, they usually need to climb something. And if there's nothing around to climb, that can be really dangerous, or just they're not very good on the ground. They actually have to crawl on their wrists and their ankles, which is kind of awkward. And so that just makes them so vulnerable on the ground that they prefer to drink in flight. And so we call it drinking on the wing. And what they will do is it requires a couple specifications. So one is that they're looking for calm water. It helps them identify it using their echolocation. It also keeps them safer, as moving water is more likely to be able to snag a wing or end them up in the water, which they don't want to be. But they need to be very precise. So they also need a larger body of water. So they're not going to be using a bird bath or a puddle very often. They generally need lakes, slow moving rivers, slow moving streams, things that give them kind of, think of it like an airport runway. And in fact, we've seen at water sources with a lot of bat activity, bats will actually coordinate their use of the water so that they're coming down to drink from the same direction to avoid collisions with each other. Because bats get their water by either dipping their jaw in to get a mouthful or lapping it up really quickly as they approach the surface, which means they need to stop echolocating, because bats echolocate through their throats and they can't drink and echolocate at the same time. And so they need to be going in the same direction. They need to have waterways free of obstacles. And they need to be able to get back out clearly and then restart their echolocation and navigation. So it's a very precision activity, drinking for bats. And so water sources are incredibly important. It's one of the #1 reasons we see bats move out of a habitat, is if water levels have gotten so low that they've exposed too many obstacles for them to be able to perform this maneuver. Or if something happens to a waterway. Invasive vegetation is also a really big concern for bats, because it can encroach on water and make it unsafe to approach. Or simply things are getting warmer, things are getting hotter, and water sources are drying up. So this is a very vague chart, but I do find that it's helpful. So in the same way that different thicknesses of forest can limit the bats that use it, so can water sources. And so the bigger the water source, the more species can use it because of that same agility and flight concern. And so this is more for the United States than just here for Washington, but the larger a water source is, the more open surface area there is, the more bat species are going to be able to utilize it. All right. I know we're getting a little close on time, so tell me if I need to stop, but I just wanted to go really quickly through some resources and things to think about when we're trying to support the bats in our habitat and increase coexistence. So Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's Habitat at Home program actually has a website and program committed to creating bat habitat. So it talks you through some of the things to think about. Plant choice and thinking about not only bats, but all nocturnal wildlife is something we don't always consider when we're kind of planning our landscaping, but it's something we can easily integrate. So I recommend checking them out. We have a link to it on Bats Northwest's website as well, or this QR code. It lists native flower species, tree species, and a few things in between that you can incorporate into your landscapes that will help support bats and other nocturnal wildlife. And then a few things people don't always realize are normal for bats, that when we're working within parks and working with the public is always kind of good to know. We talked about roost switching. And so just because a bat shows up in a weird place on a building doesn't mean they're going to stay there. Also doesn't mean that there's another colony hidden anywhere. It could just be that they're migrating through, especially in spring and fall. We get so many calls about this, at Bats Northwest. You know, oh, this bat's on the side of this building, this bat's on this tree, it's not normally there. So unless they're in danger of interacting with the public, like they're too low or they're too close to an entrance, often if you just leave them be for a night or two, they are going to move on again. Might not be the first night. If it's too cold, they may decide to stay in their kind of torpor state and then move on later. Bats flying during the day tends to really make people nervous. I understand that. We've tied it to it being that there being something wrong with that bat. But just because bats are nocturnal doesn't mean they're never seen during the daytime. Just like we are mostly diurnal creatures, we certainly go out at night. So if the weather has been bad, again, if it's migration time, if there's a reason for them to need to go out and forage and that's the only opportunity they have, they will do it. Bats don't prefer to do it because there's far more predators, flying predators in particular, out during the day. But there are reasons that they will. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with that bat. We talked about getting stuck on the ground and all the different things. Fall is another one where juveniles, like I said, they have 3 to 5 weeks to develop and grow and learn to fly before they're on a migration path. Tons of problems with juveniles in the fall, ending up on the ground because they've exhausted themselves. They aren't any good at foraging. They couldn't find a water source and they're dehydrated. It's also the time of year we get the most calls about bats in buildings. Torn screens, open windows, cracked doors often look like crevices, and they don't realize that there's an entire opening on the other side. So especially juveniles will like crawl into those spaces thinking it's somewhere they can roost and then get trapped indoors. So that's another really common one. Fish and Wildlife and Bats Northwest both have videos on what to do if there's a bat in a building, how to safely get it out, or who to call. So I highly recommend those. We talked about roosting on and near buildings. Behind signs is also really popular. Like I said, wood piles are really popular. And then, of course, some bats being active in the winter can also be a very normal thing. Couple times people find bats in different stages. I just wanted to kind of show people what different stages of bats can look like. So juvenile bats and adult bats are nearly identical by the time they're out and flying. It's going to be very hard to tell, or anyone who isn't like weighing them and taking measurements, who's an adult and who isn't. Baby bats, on the other hand, are much more distinct. So at these stages, they cannot fly. When they're born, they are teeny tiny. And so if you ever find a bat like this, you've got a colony somewhere nearby, call a rehabilitator right away. The other bat definitely furred at this point, but you can see that his ears are still down and he's significantly smaller than mom, which means he's also not able to fly yet. So if there isn't a colony that bat could be returned to, or there isn't an active bat moving around trying to pick him up, that's another time to quickly call wildlife rehab, because that's the only way that bat's going to get through. The other thing, we talked about juveniles being stuck on the ground, but I did want to really quickly, and I think this is one of my last slides, talk about torpor. So torpor is kind of that state of stasis that bats go into to conserve energy. So their breathing, heart rate, blood, body temperature, all of their systems kind of shut down to a lower rate so that they can conserve energy and not burn as much. Because of that, they also can't wake up immediately. They have a very long process that they have to go through to return their body to their normal body temperature and become fully functional again. And so if a bat is roosting somewhere and has gone into torpor and is dislodged from its roost somehow and ends up on the ground, they do have a couple involuntary motions that they make before they're fully awake just to protect themselves. One is extending their wings so that they can kind of glide down from wherever they were and land safely. They kind of are able to just extend their wings and then they're stuck. and so they'll end up on the ground with their wings out. The other is that some species, if disturbed during torpor, can actually like open their mouth and almost hiss. It's a protective mechanism to ward off predators. But if they're not fully active, they're not going to be able to then go crawl up a tree or fly off. It can take anywhere from about 5 to 30 minutes, depending on how deep into torpor they were, for them to fully arouse, and they're completely helpless until then, aside from those couple involuntary motions. So people will sometimes find a bat on the ground that's behaving oddly because it's trying to come out of this torpor state, which can also involve like shivering motions as they try to warm their body back up because they know that they're in a bad place. And so we have more information about found bats and who to call and how to handle it, but just understanding that part of bat behavior can really overcome a lot of fears that there's something wrong with a bat. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip this, but I was going to just point out that pesticide use is really hard for bats. They actually store the pesticides in their body differently, and it makes them up to 30% more susceptible to pesticide deaths compared to similar size like rodents. And we can talk about that later. Hi, did I run out of time? How did I do?
You did great. That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Nikki.
You're welcome. All things bats.
That was fascinating. I don't know why I didn't know about bat hibernation before today. I was like, today years old when I learned. I don't know why that never occurred to me. But let's get right to the slide with the word, the special code word for
yes. Do you want me to stop sharing?
I think it's going to boot you right out.
Cool.
There we go. So yeah, we have our code word here. Thank you again, Nikki, for your wonderful presentation. It's so nice. I think I'm just as excited about bats as Kate. So really happy to be able to be here for that wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Cece. Yeah, looking over the Q&A, since we really only have like a minute or so according to schedule. Well, you know, to my mind, you kind of addressed everything to some degree. You can, you know, look over these questions, but if you have time. But you know, you addressed white nose. I know that I encountered the protocols in place at Ape Cave last summer when I was there with my son. So we know that is a concern here, right?
Yeah.
Is it more
and it is
prevalent
something
here
that
than
while
another?
it doesn't impact really any species outside of bats, animals, or people, it's very spreadable by animals and people. So if you are somewhere that has those alerts up, please take them seriously.
Right. I mean, that was the one very important directive they gave us going into those caves. So let's see, how long will a bat, or how far will a bat travel from a roosting site to a water source? Did you cover that?
I didn't. There's been a fair amount of research on that, and it's very species specific. So we do have some species that will only travel like a quarter to a half mile, and then we have other species that will travel multiple miles. So it can be very dependent on the species, and we don't always know who's who. So yeah, it can be a reason your bats leave if something changes and it's only, you know, increasing the distance a little bit. It's kind of up to them. So, you know, yeah.
Okay, and one real quick one. I'd love to hear more about that last point on pesticide accumulation in bats. Is there any difference in effects between insecticides versus herbicides?
Ooh, I don't know that I have the research to know if there's a difference between pesticides and herbicides. The only research I've come across is directed at pesticides, and the reason that that is so impactful for bats is because they use torpor. And so when trace amounts of pesticides get, you know, onto the insects they're eating or the water they're drinking, unlike most mammals where it just moves through their bloodstream, it actually can get stored in this very specific, it's called brown adipose tissue. It's a fat store that they use specifically for arousing from torpor. And so if trace amounts accumulate in there, when they use that, when they burn that fat up all at once to come out of torpor, it releases all of that built up pesticide into their system at the same time and can kill them a lot faster than other animals because of that exact reason. So it actually accumulates inside them differently and then gets released all at once.
Ooh,
Yeah,
okay.
kind of brutal.
Okay.
But I don't know
Okay.
the answer about herbicide versus pesticide.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I
Mhm.
appreciate it, and so does everyone else. I'll turn
Yeah.
it back to Kate.
One last thing I didn't get to, we do have information on our website if you ever encounter a colony that needs to be humanely excluded from a building or other personal space. That's a really important one. And the biggest thing to keep in mind is that during that short maternity season of late June to early September, it's the one time that we will beg you not to move a colony, especially in Washington, where any group of bats that time of year is usually a maternity colony, because it's very easy to trap babies inside and mothers outside. And that's kind of like a big generational loss that is going to take us quite a long time to repopulate.
That's critical.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, all right, great. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'm assuming your website is just, I don't know, I was Northwest.
That's northwest.org. Yeah.
Perfect.
Very
Hey,
easy.
thank you so much, Nikki.
You're welcome.
I would also like to thank all three of our speakers today. So that's Dr. Thomas Whitney of Davy Tree, Kevin O'Connor from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, and of course you, Nikki Desautel of Bats Northwest. And I just want to give a shout out and a reminder to everybody that Nikki's book, For the Love of Bats, will be published this October. So we can all check that out. I also want to give a big thank you to the webinar planning committee. So Bridget Kelsch, our committee chair from Parks and Rec, Cece Miller and Joel Ferrero of City Light, Steve Sosi of Seattle Center, Mark Malone and Eric Sterner, also of Parks and Rec, Gary Wren of SDOT, and I'm Kate Kurtz. I'm with Seattle Public Utilities. Hey, and thanks to all of you guys joining us today. So today's session was the second of 3 IPM webinars that we're hosting this year. Bridget will be sending a link to the recording and other shared information when it becomes available. I just want to give a reminder also that it does take a little bit of time to process all of the credits on our end, and then we give that over to WSDA and ISA. So, so you have not seen the credits from the last presentation come through yet, and that's because we're still working on it. So thank you for your patience. It is happening, though it just takes a little bit of time. And then what was my last announcement? Oh yeah, it was our survey. So Bridget will put a survey link in the chat, or you can connect with it on that QR code that's right there on the screen. And we just really appreciate you filling that out. Thank you so much. Okay, bye guys.